In 1990, when Chinese archaeologists opened the first of hundreds of wooden boat coffins buried in the scorching sands of the Taklamakan Desert, they found themselves staring into the perfectly preserved face of a woman who had been dead for 4,000 years. Her features were sharp, European, unmistakable. Her hair was auburn, braided intricately around her head. Her skin, though dried by millennia in the desert heat, showed the remnants of a light complexion. She wore a felt hat that rose to a peaked point, leather boots that reached her knees, and a woven woolen dress dyed in colors that had somehow survived the ravages of time. Beside her lay tools, food, cheese wrapped carefully in leather, and objects that suggested a sophisticated farming society that cultivated wheat and barley, herded cattle and sheep, and understood the delicate art of irrigation in one of the harshest environments on Earth. But here's what made this discovery truly explosive, what transformed it from merely fascinating to potentially paradigm-shattering, what suggested that everything we thought we understood about ancient human migration and the spread of civilization across Asia might be fundamentally wrong. This woman wasn't supposed to be here. Caucasian features, red and blonde hair, European-style clothing and burial practices. These weren't supposed to exist in the heart of China 4 millennia ago, thousands of miles from the nearest Bronze Age European settlements, separated from the Mediterranean world by mountain ranges, steppes, and deserts that ancient peoples supposedly couldn't cross. The conventional narrative of human history insisted that East and West were separate worlds during this period, that technological and cultural exchange between them was minimal at best, that populations remained largely isolated in their respective regions until much later when the Silk Road would finally connect these distant civilizations. The discovery should have triggered immediate international collaboration, should have mobilized genetic researchers and archaeologists from every major university, should have prompted urgent investigation into who these people were and how they ended up in one of the most remote and inhospitable places on the planet. Instead, it sparked decades of controversy, academic feuding, political sensitivity, and bureaucratic obstruction that revealed as much about modern anxieties as it did about ancient mysteries. Chinese authorities restricted access to the mummies, limited foreign researchers' ability to conduct DNA analysis, and expressed discomfort with findings that suggested the Tarim Basin's earliest inhabitants might not have been ancestors of modern Han Chinese or Uyghur populations. The mummies became political symbols in ongoing ethnic tensions in Xinjiang, claimed by Uyghur activists as proof that they were the region's indigenous people, countered by Chinese officials who emphasized that genetic heritage was more complex than simplistic narratives allowed. Yet the mummies themselves remained silent witnesses to a truth that transcended modern political boundaries, that spoke to questions far more profound than territorial claims or ethnic identity. They represented something unprecedented in the archaeological record, a population that appeared suddenly in the historical record around 2000 BCE, with no clear origin, no obvious migration route, no genetic connection to the surrounding cultures that logic and geography suggested should have been their ancestors or relatives. They built settlements along the shifting oases of the Tarim Basin, constructed irrigation systems that allowed agriculture in the desert, developed a material culture that showed influences from distant regions yet remained distinctly their own. And then, just as mysteriously as they appeared, they vanished from history, leaving behind only their perfectly preserved dead, and more questions than answers. The woman from the first excavated boat coffin would come to be known as the Beauty of Lulan, named for the ancient city near where she was found, and she would become the most famous of what researchers would eventually call the Tarim Mummies. But she was far from alone. Over the next 2 decades, archaeologists would uncover hundreds more bodies from cemeteries scattered across the basin, from Xiaohe in the west to Lulan in the east, from Kevrigul in the north to Cherchen in the south. The preservation was extraordinary, unprecedented, miraculous. The desert's extreme aridity had naturally mummified the bodies, creating time capsules that preserved not just bones, but soft tissue, hair, clothing, food, tools, even the last meal consumed before death. Scientists could examine their skin, their internal organs, their facial features with a clarity that Egyptian mummies, deliberately preserved through complex chemical processes, rarely achieved. And the more bodies they found, the more puzzling the mystery became, because the population showed remarkable physical diversity, despite genetic evidence that would later prove they were remarkably isolated. Some had red hair, others blonde, still others dark brown. Some stood over 6 feet tall, others were shorter. Some showed features that looked Northern European, others Central Asian. Still others seemed to blend characteristics from multiple populations. Their clothing varied from site to site, from period to period, showing evolving styles and technologies that incorporated wool felting, weaving techniques, and dye processes that suggested contact with distant cultures or independent innovation of remarkable sophistication. Their burial practices were equally varied, though the boat coffins remained a consistent and deeply puzzling feature. Massive wooden structures shaped like overturned vessels, placed in the desert far from any water source, marked with towering wooden poles carved to resemble oars, thrust into the sand like monuments to some unknown spiritual belief. The academic community divided sharply over how to interpret these findings, split into camps that reflected broader debates about migration, cultural diffusion, and the origins of civilization in Central Asia. One group insisted the mummies must be Indo-European migrants, early speakers of Tocharian languages who had traveled from the western steppes, bringing with them the pastoral economy, the wheeled vehicles, the woolen textiles that characterized Bronze Age cultures from Ukraine to the Altai Mountains. They pointed to the physical features, the material culture, the agricultural practices as evidence of Western origins, argued that only migration could explain how European-looking people ended up in the Tarim Basin, suggested that these were the eastern vanguard of the great Indo-European expansion that had spread farming and herding across Eurasia during the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE. Another group proposed a different origin, suggesting connections to the Bactria-Margiana archaeological complex, the mysterious Bronze Age civilization that flourished in what is now Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and northern Afghanistan. The Bmak culture had sophisticated urban centers, advanced metallurgy, extensive trade networks that reached from Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley, and agricultural techniques perfectly suited for oasis settlements in arid environments. Perhaps, these researchers argued, the Tarim population represented a Bmak offshoot, migrants who had traveled north and east from Central Asian oases to establish similar settlements in the Tarim Basin, bringing with them the knowledge of irrigation, the crops, the pastoral economy that the archaeological record clearly documented. Still others suggested multiple origins, waves of migration from different sources at different times, each contributing to the genetic and cultural mix that the mummies represented. This interpretation had the advantage of explaining the physical diversity, the variation in burial practices, the evolution of material culture over the 1,000-year period that the cemeteries documented. It allowed for complexity, acknowledged that ancient populations were mobile and interactive, proposed that the Tarim Basin served as a crossroads where different peoples met, mingled, and created something new that transcended their individual origins. This view aligned with the emerging understanding of the Silk Road not as a single route established at a specific moment, but as a network of pathways that had facilitated exchange across Central Asia for millennia before the formal trade routes that would carry silk from China to Rome. But all these theories, all these careful academic arguments built on analysis of physical features and material culture, all these reconstructions of possible migration routes and cultural connections would be shattered by technology that didn't exist when the first mummies were discovered, that could answer questions the original excavators couldn't even formulate, that would reveal a truth stranger than any hypothesis the researchers had proposed. In 2021, an international team of geneticists published the results of DNA analysis conducted on 13 of the best-preserved early mummies, individuals dated to between 2135 and 1623 BCE, representing the founding population of the Tarim Basin settlements. The genetic data was clear, was unambiguous. was shocking in its implications, and it contradicted every major theory about the mummies' origins. They weren't Indo-European migrants from the western steppes. They showed no genetic connection to the Afanasyevo culture, the early Bronze Age population that had brought Indo-European languages and Yamnaya ancestry to the Altai region. They weren't BMAC offshoots from Central Asian oases. They lacked the genetic signatures that characterized that civilization. They weren't a mixture of different migrant groups. Instead, they were something unprecedented, something that shouldn't have been possible, something that forced complete reconsideration of how populations survived, adapted, and maintained identity in the ancient world. They were a genetically isolated local population, descended from ancient North Eurasians, a Pleistocene people who had inhabited Siberia during the Ice Age and who were thought to have largely disappeared from the genetic record by the early Holocene, absorbed through mixing with other populations as the glaciers retreated and new peoples moved into previously frozen territories. The Tarim mummies represented the best-preserved remnant of this ancient gene pool, a population that had somehow maintained genetic isolation for thousands of years while the world around them underwent dramatic transformations, while new peoples migrated across the steppes, while civilizations rose in Mesopotamia and Egypt and the Indus Valley, while Bronze Age cultures spread farming and herding from Europe to East Asia. They had adopted agriculture, had embraced pastoralism, had learned to make cheese and cultivate wheat and build irrigation systems, all technologies that came from neighboring cultures, all innovations that the DNA evidence proved they had absorbed through cultural exchange rather than through the genetic mixing that usually accompanied such technological transfers. They were genetically isolated but culturally cosmopolitan, a paradox that challenged fundamental assumptions about how human societies develop, how technologies spread, how populations maintain or lose their identity in the face of change. And this revelation transformed the mystery of the Tarim mummies from a question about where they came from into something far more profound, far more disturbing, far more relevant to understanding human history and human nature. The question became not who they were or how they arrived, but why they remained so isolated, what circumstances allowed or forced them to maintain genetic separation while actively engaging with surrounding cultures, what their existence revealed about the complexity of ancient societies that simple models of migration and cultural diffusion couldn't capture. The answer to that question, if it could be found, might illuminate not just the history of one small population in a remote desert, but the entire pattern of human movement, adaptation, and survival across thousands of years. The preservation of the Tarim mummies wasn't just remarkable, it was unprecedented in ways that most archaeological discoveries could never approach, that offered researchers a level of detail about ancient lives that typically remained forever lost to time, that transformed these individuals from abstract historical concepts into tangible human beings whose last moments, whose clothing choices, whose final meals could be examined with startling intimacy. The Taklamakan Desert, whose name is often translated as "go in and you won't come out," created through its extreme aridity and temperature fluctuations, a natural mummification process that required no human intervention, no elaborate chemical treatments, no careful wrapping in resins and linens. The bodies simply dried where they lay, their soft tissues dehydrating so rapidly in the desert heat that bacterial decomposition had no opportunity to take hold, their cells collapsing and hardening into leathery preservation that could last for millennia if the burial remained undisturbed and protected from moisture. What emerged from the sand when archaeologists carefully excavated the boat, coffins were not skeletal remains requiring careful reconstruction and artistic interpretation, but actual faces, actual bodies, actual people who looked remarkably as they had in life, who retained their hair, their skin, their facial features, even their internal organs in sufficient condition for modern analysis. The beauty of Lulan showed delicate features, high cheekbones, a narrow nose, auburn hair that had been carefully braided, evidence of age lines around her eyes that suggested she had lived to perhaps 40 years old, a respectable age in the Bronze Age when childbirth, disease, and the harsh environment claimed many before they reached such maturity. Her hands were preserved well enough that researchers could examine her fingernails, could see that they had been kept relatively clean and trimmed, could analyze the tissue beneath them for information about her diet and health in her final months of life. The clothing that adorned these bodies told stories of technological sophistication that challenged assumptions about Bronze Age textile production in Central Asia, that revealed knowledge of weaving techniques scholars had previously associated only with Western cultures, that demonstrated either remarkable independent innovation or extensive cultural exchange networks spanning thousands of miles. The beauty of Lulan wore a felt hat, tall and pointed, made through a process that required understanding how wool fibers could be matted together through moisture, heat, and pressure to create a dense, waterproof fabric without any weaving at all. Her dress was woven from wool in a diagonal twill pattern, a technique that required a sophisticated loom capable of lifting warp threads in specific sequences to create the characteristic diagonal ridges that made the fabric stronger, more flexible, and more resistant to tearing than simple, plain weave cloth. Her boots were leather, carefully cut and stitched, reaching to her knees, practical footwear for someone who spent significant time walking across desert sands and rocky terrain. But it was at the Xiaohe Cemetery, excavated systematically between 2003 and 2005, that the full scope of the material culture became apparent. That researchers encountered burial practices so elaborate and so strange that they seemed to combine elements from multiple cultures while belonging fully to none of them, that raised as many questions as they answered about the spiritual beliefs and practical concerns of the people who created them. The site contained 167 documented burials, though erosion and ancient looting had destroyed perhaps twice that many more, all concentrated in an area roughly 200 meters long and 20 meters wide, a massive necropolis in the middle of absolute desolation, where nothing lived and nothing grew, except during the brief periods when seasonal rivers might flow nearby, before disappearing again into the sand. Each burial featured the distinctive, boat-shaped coffin, constructed from poplar wood that had been carefully shaped and fitted, measuring typically 2 to 3 meters in length, placed upside down over the body like a protective shell, then covered with cattle hides that had been staked to the ground to secure the entire structure. Rising from the sand above each burial stood wooden poles, some carved to resemble oars with broad, flat blades at their tops, others shaped into more abstract forms, all painted with red and black pigments that had somehow survived 4,000 years of sun and sand and wind. These markers reached heights of up to 4 meters, visible from considerable distances across the flat desert landscape, transforming the cemetery into a forest of vertical monuments that must have been striking, impressive, perhaps intimidating to anyone who encountered them. The symbolism seemed nautical, seemed to invoke boats and water and journeys, yet the cemetery stood in one of the driest places on Earth, far from any permanent water source, surrounded by sand dunes and salt flats where no boat could ever sail. The disconnect between the burial symbolism and the environmental reality was absolute, profound, mystifying. Recent analysis of these burial practices, published in 2025, proposed that the boat imagery might relate not to maritime traditions carried from distant homelands, but to the vital importance of seasonal waterways in the Tarim Basin environment, to the rivers and streams that would appear briefly when mountain snow melted or rare rains fell, creating temporary oases where grass could grow, where cattle could graze, where agriculture could briefly flourish before the water disappeared again and the desert reasserted its dominance. The Xiaohe people, according to this interpretation, based their entire existence on these ephemeral waterways, on their ability to predict where water would appear, on their skill in exploiting these brief windows of abundance, and the boat burials represented not memories of distant seas, but acknowledgement of the rivers that made life possible. Perhaps even a spiritual belief that death involved a journey along waterways to some afterlife destination where water flowed eternally and the struggle for survival ended. The cattle remains found in many burials reinforced this interpretation. Massive skulls with impressive horns positioned near the head of the deceased, hides draped over the boat coffins, evidence of pastoral economy centered on herding animals that required constant movement to follow grass and water across the shifting landscape. Analysis of teeth from sacrificed cattle showed they had grazed on a variety of plants, had moved across different elevations and vegetation zones, confirming that the Xiaohe people practiced transhumance, seasonal migration between pastures, the kind of mobile pastoralism that characterized many Bronze Age societies across Eurasia. Yet they also practiced agriculture, also grew wheat and barley and millet, also understood irrigation techniques that allowed cultivation in desert conditions, combining sedentary farming with mobile herding in ways that required sophisticated environmental knowledge and careful social organization to coordinate the different economic activities. The textiles found with the mummies revealed even more sophistication, even more puzzling connections to distant cultures, even more evidence of either remarkable parallel development or extensive exchange networks that left no other archaeological traces. Textile expert Elizabeth Wayland Barber, who has spent decades analyzing fabrics from archaeological contexts across Eurasia, examined the Tarim materials and found herself confronting patterns and techniques that shouldn't have existed in Bronze Age Central Asia according to conventional chronologies. She found diagonal twill weaves, she found tartans with color stripes of uneven width, crossing in both warp and weft directions to create distinctive plaid patterns. She found sophisticated dyeing techniques using plant materials to create rich reds, deep blues, vibrant yellows that had survived millennia in the dry desert conditions. The tartan patterns were particularly striking, particularly significant, because tartans are rare globally, require considerable planning and mathematical precision to execute, and had previously been associated primarily with the Hallstatt culture of Central Europe, specifically with textile fragments recovered from salt mines in Austria dating to roughly the same period. The similarity was too specific to dismiss as coincidence, too technically precise to attribute to independent invention, yet there was no evidence of direct contact between the Tarim Basin and Central Europe during the Bronze Age. No trade routes, no shared artifacts beyond these textile patterns, no genetic connection between the populations that might suggest migration or regular exchange. Barber concluded that the textiles indicated a common origin with Indo-European Neolithic clothing techniques or a common low-level textile technology, carefully hedging her interpretation to acknowledge both the striking similarities and the problematic lack of supporting evidence for how such similarities could have arisen. The Tarim weavers understood diagonal twill, understood color patterning, understood felting, understood techniques for creating weatherproof outer garments using long hop twill, where weft threads skipped over multiple warp threads before binding, creating thick, heavy fabric ideal for protection against wind and cold and sand. They also produced brocaded fabrics, decorative textiles, where supplementary weft threads created patterns against a plain background, demonstrating aesthetic concerns beyond mere functionality, indicating that these people cared about appearance, about style, about creating beautiful objects even in their harsh environment. Fragment after fragment showed geometric patterns, concentric lozenges, bands of color and texture, designs that required planning and skill to execute. One particularly impressive piece showed rows of diamond shapes in red and blue against white wool background, with a seam line joining two selvages woven specifically to match up, proving that the design had been planned before weaving began, that the weaver understood how the pattern would align when the pieces were sewn together, displaying the kind of advanced planning and technical mastery that comes only from long tradition and accumulated experience. The color palette itself told stories about knowledge of natural dyes, about understanding which plants yielded which colors, about mastering the mordanting processes that made dyes permanent rather than washing out with the first rain. They used madder root for reds, produced a range of shades from pink to deep crimson, depending on the preparation and application. They used indigo or possibly woad for blues, though the exact source remained difficult to determine from the degraded ancient textiles. They combined dyes to create purples, browns, complex multi-toned effects that showed experimentation and refinement. Some fabrics showed painted designs rather than woven patterns, indicating yet another decorative technique, another avenue for artistic expression in a culture that archaeology had largely defined through burial practices and preserved bodies rather than through art or architecture or written records. The clothing styles themselves were distinctive, recognizable, consistent across multiple burial sites and spanning several centuries, suggesting strong cultural continuity, shared identity, deliberate maintenance of traditional forms, even as individual elements evolved. The pointed felt hats appeared repeatedly, their tall conical shape distinctive and consistent, clearly a cultural marker, something that identified the wearer as belonging to this particular group. Men and women both wore these hats, though the styles showed subtle variations, different heights, different proportions, different decorative elements. The boots were equally distinctive, knee-high leather footwear that protected the legs and feet, practical in terrain where thorny plants, sharp rocks, scorpions, and extreme temperature variations made bare feet or simple sandals inadequate. The dresses and tunics showed careful tailoring, garments cut and sewn to fit the body rather than simply draped, indicating understanding of pattern making, of how fabric behaved, of how to create functional, comfortable clothing that allowed movement while providing protection. Perhaps most intriguing were the accessories, the personal items that revealed individual choices, that showed these were not generic ancient people, but specific individuals with preferences and possessions and identities. Many mummies wore jewelry, simple necklaces of stone or bone beads, occasionally more elaborate pieces. Some carried small bags or pouches, containers for personal items whose contents had usually decayed beyond recognition, but whose existence showed they traveled with possessions, with tools or ornaments or items they considered necessary or valuable. The famous cheese found wrapped around the necks of several mummies, analyzed in 2024 using proteomics techniques that could identify ancient proteins, proved to be kefir cheese, made using bacterial cultures and fermentation techniques that transformed milk into a preserved protein source that could survive without refrigeration, that could be stored and transported, that represented sophisticated understanding of food processing and preservation. This cheese was particularly significant because it demonstrated conclusively what the genetic data had already suggested, that the Tarim people had adopted dairy pastoralism, had learned to exploit cattle and goats for milk production, had mastered the techniques for processing that milk into cheese and yogurt and kefir, all technologies that originated elsewhere, that spread across Eurasia during the Bronze Age, that the Tarim population incorporated into their culture despite maintaining genetic isolation. The kefir-making process required specific bacterial and yeast cultures, required knowledge that had to be transmitted from person to person, culture to culture, because the microorganisms didn't occur naturally and couldn't be independently discovered. Someone had to teach the Tarim people how to make kefir cheese, had to share the starter cultures, had to explain the process, proving definitively that they were not completely isolated, not cut off from the wider world, not living in ignorance of developments happening across Central Asia and beyond. The babies buried at Xiaohe were particularly poignant, particularly well preserved, particularly revealing about the care and concern this culture showed for its dead, regardless of age or status. One infant, perhaps a year old, wore a tiny felt cap colored red and blue, wrapped in a blanket woven from brown wool that had been dyed to create a variable purplish hue, tied with twisted cords in red and blue. Blue stones covered the eyes. Wisps of red wool had been carefully placed to stop up the nostrils, preparations that showed ritualistic concern for the body, for its treatment in death, for ensuring proper transition to whatever afterlife they believed awaited. This wasn't a hasty burial, wasn't disposal of a corpse. but careful preparation of a loved one for a journey, attention to detail that revealed emotional investment, grief, hope that death wasn't the end but a transformation. The preservation allowed analysis of these infant remains revealed information about mortality, about the dangers of Bronze Age childhood, about the diseases and conditions that claimed young lives. Several showed evidence of malnutrition, of periods when food was scarce and growth slowed. Others showed signs of infectious disease, though the specific pathogens couldn't be identified from the degraded tissue. The mere fact that infants were buried with such care, with the same elaborate boat coffins and pole markers as adults, demonstrated that this culture valued its children, recognized them as full members of society deserving of proper burial rites, contrasting with some ancient societies where infant remains were disposed of with minimal ceremony. But underlying all these details, all these preserved textiles and careful burials and sophisticated technologies, remained the central mystery that the DNA analysis had revealed, the question that transformed the Tarim mummies from interesting archaeological curiosity into profound historical puzzle. These people, with their European features and their advanced weaving and their kefir cheese and their wheat agriculture, were genetically isolated, were the last surviving population of ancient North Eurasians, were carrying a genetic legacy from the Pleistocene that had disappeared almost everywhere else through mixing and migration and population replacement. They had somehow maintained their genetic identity for thousands of years while simultaneously adopting technologies and practices from surrounding cultures, creating a paradox that challenged fundamental assumptions about how human societies develop, about the relationship between genes and culture, about what it means to be isolated or integrated in the ancient world. The DNA analysis that shattered every theory about the Tarim mummies' origins wasn't conducted hastily, wasn't based on preliminary results that might later be revised, wasn't the work of a single laboratory that might have made methodological errors requiring replication. The study, published in the journal Nature in October 2021, represented years of careful extraction, sequencing, and analysis of genetic material from 18 individuals spanning from the early Bronze Age through the Iron Age, 13 from the critical earliest period between 2135 and 1623 BCE, when the Tarim culture first appeared in the archaeological record, 5 from later periods showing how the population changed over time as the isolation that characterized the early phase gradually broke down through contact with neighboring groups. The research team included specialists from Jilin University in China, Seoul National University in South Korea, and the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Germany, institutions with established reputations for rigorous archaeogenetic work, access to cutting-edge sequencing technology, and experience analyzing ancient DNA from challenging preservation contexts. The technical challenges were substantial, formidable, requiring methods that hadn't existed even a decade earlier, when earlier attempts at genetic analysis of the mummies had failed or produced ambiguous results that couldn't definitively answer the questions researchers were asking. Ancient DNA degrades over time, breaks into increasingly shorter fragments as chemical bonds break and strands fragment, becomes contaminated with DNA from bacteria and fungi that colonize dead tissue, and often survives in such low concentrations that extracting usable material requires processing large amounts of skeletal or tissue material with sophisticated chemical techniques that can isolate and concentrate the remaining ancient genetic material while removing contaminants that would overwhelm the signal researchers needed to detect. The Tarim mummies, despite their remarkable soft tissue preservation, didn't necessarily have better DNA preservation than skeletons from the same period, because the processes that mummified the tissue, the desiccation and chemical changes caused by desert conditions, could damage DNA even while preserving visible structures. But the team succeeded, extracted sufficient high-quality genetic material to sequence whole genomes rather than just mitochondrial DNA or selected chromosomes, generated data comprehensive enough to reconstruct these individuals' ancestry with unprecedented precision, to detect admixture events that might have occurred generations or centuries before the individuals lived, to compare their genetic profiles against databases containing thousands of ancient genomes from populations across Eurasia spanning tens of thousands of years. What emerged from this analysis was unambiguous, definitive, shocking in its clarity and its implications. The 13 early Tarim mummies showed approximately 72% ancestry from ancient North Eurasians, specifically the population represented by remains found at Afontova Gora in Siberia, dated to around 14,000 BCE, and approximately 28% ancestry from ancient Northeast Asians, the population represented by early Bronze Age individuals from the Baikal region. They showed zero detectable ancestry from Indo-European populations, zero genetic connection to the Afanasyevo culture whose migration across the steppes brought Western ancestry to the Altai region and beyond, zero relationship to the Biemak culture whose sophisticated agricultural settlements dotted Central Asia from Turkmenistan to Uzbekistan to northern Afghanistan. The ancient North Eurasians themselves were something of a ghost population in human genetic history, known primarily through a handful of ancient remains scattered across Siberia and represented today only as a fractional component in modern populations rather than surviving intact anywhere on Earth. The population emerged during the Upper Paleolithic, inhabited the vast territories of northern Eurasia during the last ice age, when massive glaciers covered much of Europe and northern Asia, developed the sophisticated hunting technologies and social organizations necessary to survive in periglacial environments where resources were scarce, temperatures were brutal, and survival required detailed environmental knowledge and careful planning. They left archaeological evidence of their presence in the form of distinctive stone tools, elaborate art objects carved from mammoth ivory, and burial practices that showed spiritual beliefs and concern for the dead, but they disappeared from most of their range as the climate warmed at the end of the Pleistocene, absorbed through genetic mixing into the populations that expanded into previously glaciated territories or pushed into marginal environments where they gradually diminished. The genetic legacy they left was substantial, foundational, critically important for understanding the ancestry of populations across northern Eurasia and the Americas, yet fragmented and diluted through millennia of admixture. Modern Native American populations carry significant ANE ancestry, inherited through their ancestors who crossed from Siberia into the Americas during the late Pleistocene when lower sea levels created the Bering Land Bridge connecting the continents. Modern populations in northern Eurasia, from Scandinavia to Siberia, carry variable amounts of ANE ancestry mixed with later population movements. But nowhere did ANE ancestry survive at the high concentrations found in the Tarim mummies. Nowhere did a population maintain such direct connection to this Pleistocene gene pool into the Holocene and the Bronze Age. Nowhere else could researchers find such a clear window into what AN populations were like genetically before they were absorbed into the broader Eurasian population mixture. The Tarim mummies, according to the genetic analysis, represented the best representatives of ancient North Eurasians surviving into historical times, a population that had somehow remained genetically isolated for approximately 14,000 years while the world around them transformed beyond recognition, while the Ice Age ended and climates warmed and glaciers retreated and sea levels rose and agriculture spread and civilizations emerged and Bronze Age cultures spread across Eurasia. The isolation wasn't absolute. The 28% ancient Northeast Asian ancestry proved they had mixed with neighboring populations at some point in their history, but that mixing appeared to have occurred early, perhaps during the late Pleistocene or early Holocene, creating a hybrid population that then maintained its genetic composition without further admixture for thousands of years, leading up to the Bronze Age individuals whose mummified remains provided the genetic material for analysis. This extended isolation was extraordinary, unprecedented in the Bronze Age world, contrary to everything researchers understood about this period of human history when populations were supposedly mobile, when trade networks connected distant regions, when technological innovations spread rapidly across thousands of miles, when genetic studies of other ancient populations consistently showed admixture events reflecting the movement and mixing that characterized the era. The Bronze Age saw the Indo-European expansion across the steppes, saw the spread of wheeled vehicles and horse domestication and metallurgy and fortified settlements and social hierarchies. It saw the Bimak culture flourishing in Central Asian oases with its characteristic turquoise beads and elaborate ceramics and urban planning. It saw the Sintashta culture developing chariots in the Ural region. It saw trade connecting Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley, connecting China to Central Asia, connecting the Mediterranean to the Black Sea steppes. Populations moved, mixed, exchanged genes along with technologies and ideas and material goods. Yet the Tarim population remained apart, maintained genetic boundaries that weren't being maintained elsewhere, somehow avoided the mixing that was occurring among their neighbors and across the broader region. The neighboring Dzungarian Basin, just to the north, across relatively modest geographic barriers, showed completely different genetic profiles during the same period. The early Bronze Age inhabitants there had substantial Afanasyevo ancestry, were directly connected to the Western steppe populations, whose migration had brought Indo-European languages and genetic ancestry across Eurasia. They represented exactly the kind of mixed population that researchers expected to find throughout Central Asia during this period, exactly the pattern of migration and admixture that made sense given the archaeological evidence and the broader understanding of Bronze Age demography. But the Tarim population, despite being neighbors, despite living in adjacent basins, despite the geographic proximity that should have facilitated contact and exchange and intermarriage, remained genetically separate. The genetic isolation became even more puzzling when considered alongside the cultural evidence that clearly demonstrated the Tarim population wasn't isolated in terms of knowledge and technology. They had wheat and barley, crops that originated in the Fertile Crescent thousands of miles to the west, that spread across Eurasia during the Neolithic and Bronze Age, that required someone to bring seeds and knowledge of cultivation techniques to the Tarim Basin. They had domestic cattle, sheep, and goats, animals that were domesticated in Western Asia and that spread eastward through human migration and trade. They had woolen textiles using techniques that showed clear connections to Western traditions, that required specific knowledge of spinning and weaving and felting that had to be learned and transmitted. They had kefir cheese, made using bacterial cultures that had to come from somewhere, that couldn't be independently invented. That proved definitively they had contact with populations who already practiced dairy fermentation. The paradox was absolute, irreconcilable, using simple models of population interaction. Cultural cosmopolitan combined with genetic isolation shouldn't have been possible, shouldn't have been stable over centuries, shouldn't have persisted in a region that wasn't truly remote or inaccessible, but rather sat along what would later become major trade routes connecting east and west. The Tarim Basin wasn't an isolated island cut off from contact by oceans or impassable mountains. It was surrounded by other Bronze Age populations, was crossed by rivers that could serve as communication routes, had mountain passes connecting it to adjacent regions. Trade goods from later periods demonstrate that people moved through this region, that connections existed, that the geographic barriers weren't insurmountable. Yet somehow, the early Tarim population maintained genetic boundaries while maintaining permeable cultural boundaries, creating a situation that didn't fit any existing model of how ancient societies developed and interacted. Several explanations have been proposed, none entirely satisfactory, all requiring assumptions about social practices and cultural norms that leave no direct archaeological trace but must be inferred from the genetic patterns. Perhaps the Tarim population practiced strict endogamy, married only within their group, maintained cultural or religious prohibitions against mixing with outsiders even while trading with them and learning from them. Such practices are known ethnographically, documented among various populations who maintain genetic distinctiveness through cultural rules about marriage and identity. But proving such practices existed 4,000 years ago, based solely on genetic data and burial practices and preserved artifacts is methodologically challenging, requires inferring belief systems and social structures that might have been complex and nuanced in ways that can't be reconstructed from material remains alone. Perhaps the isolation reflected small population size, demographic factors that limited opportunities for admixture, even if no deliberate social barriers existed. A small founding population settling the Tarim Basin, perhaps a few hundred individuals at most, might have had limited contact with outsiders simply because their settlements were dispersed, their numbers were few, their territories were large relative to population density. Trade and cultural exchange might have occurred through small-scale interactions, occasional meetings at oasis locations, exchanges that transmitted knowledge and goods and technologies without necessarily leading to intermarriage or genetic mixing. If the Tarim population actively recruited or welcomed outsiders into their communities, if they practiced exogamy and sought marriage partners from neighboring groups, then the genetic isolation would be difficult to explain. But if they were self-contained, reproduced primarily within their own population, limited interactions with outsiders to economic exchanges, and occasional knowledge transfer, then genetic isolation might persist even while cultural exchange continued. Perhaps the isolation reflected geographical factors that were more significant than modern analysis suggests, environmental barriers that made travel between the Tarim Basin and neighboring regions difficult and dangerous enough that it occurred rarely, that population movements were restricted even if they weren't impossible. The Taklamakan Desert is hostile territory, one of the world's harshest desert environments, where water is scarce, temperatures are extreme, sandstorms can be deadly, and survival requires detailed knowledge of where oases are located, when seasonal rivers might flow, how to travel safely through terrain that offers few landmarks and many dangers. Bronze Age populations without sophisticated navigation tools, without detailed maps, without vehicles suited for desert travel, might have found movement through this environment daunting enough that it occurred infrequently, that most people remained near their home settlements throughout their lives, that the movements necessary for trade and cultural exchange were undertaken by specialized traders or particular individuals rather than representing widespread population mobility. Perhaps the genetic isolation reflects something about the initial colonization of the Tarim Basin, about who the founders were and why they settled in such a challenging environment. The earliest archaeological evidence for settlement in the basin dates to around 2000 BCE, appearing relatively suddenly in the record without obvious precursor populations, suggesting these weren't people who gradually adapted to desert conditions over many generations, but rather a population that moved into the region already possessing the necessary technologies and knowledge to survive there. They brought agriculture, brought pastoralism, brought sophisticated textile production, brought burial practices that were fully formed rather than evolving in place. This suggests they came from somewhere, migrated from some other location, yet the genetic data shows they weren't recent migrants from the steppe or from Central Asian oases, but rather represented an ancient population that had persisted somewhere for thousands of years before appearing in the Tarim Basin. Where they came from, where this ANE population survived during the Holocene before settling the Tarim Basin, remains one of the study's unanswered questions, one of the mysteries that genetic analysis revealed but couldn't resolve. The nearest comparable populations genetically were scattered Siberian groups, but none showed the kind of close relationship that would indicate recent separation. The Tarim population had diverged from other ANE-related groups thousands of years earlier, had been separate long enough to develop their distinctive genetic profile through drift and their own demographic history. Somewhere in Central Asia, probably in mountain regions or other marginal environments where they avoided contact and mixing with the populations that were spreading across the lowlands and steppes during the Neolithic and Bronze Age, this ANE population persisted, maintained their genetic identity, developed the cultural practices and technologies that would allow them to settle the desert oases of the Tarim Basin when they finally moved there. The move itself must have been deliberate, must have been motivated by something, must have required organization and planning, because successfully settling a desert region demands immediate access to water, food, shelter, and the knowledge necessary to survive in an environment that kills the unprepared. They couldn't have stumbled into the Tarim Basin by accident and gradually figured out how to survive there. They must have known what they were doing, must have scouted the territory beforehand, must have identified viable oasis locations and understood how to access groundwater through wells, how to manage seasonal rivers through irrigation, how to cultivate crops suited to the climate and soil conditions. This suggests sophisticated environmental knowledge, organized social structures capable of coordinating migration and settlement, and possibly pressure or motivation to leave wherever they had been living previously and seek new territories in challenging environments. Perhaps they were being displaced, pushed out of better territories by other populations who were expanding, migrating, competing for resources in regions that were more hospitable and more desirable. The Bronze Age was a period of population movements across Eurasia, of Indo-European groups spreading east and south from the steppes, of agricultural populations expanding into new territories, of competition and conflict over pasture lands and farmlands and water sources. A small population descended from Ice Age hunters, perhaps still practicing primarily hunting and gathering or limited pastoralism, might have found themselves unable to compete with the larger, more organized, more technologically advanced groups who were spreading across the regions they had previously occupied. Rather than being absorbed through admixture, rather than accepting subordinate status within expanding empires or cultural spheres, they might have chosen to migrate to marginal territories where they could maintain their independence, their cultural practices, their identity. Or perhaps the move was positive rather than negative, opportunity rather than displacement, the discovery of a niche where their particular knowledge and skills allowed them to thrive. The Tarim Basin oases, while challenging, offered reliable water in an otherwise arid region, offered opportunities for agriculture and pastoralism, offered isolation and independence for a group that valued maintaining their distinctiveness. If they had developed over generations the specific knowledge necessary to survive in arid environments, if they understood desert ecology and hydrology better than neighboring populations who lived in steppes or mountains or forests, then the Tarim Basin might have represented ideal territory, a place where they had advantages that would allow them to succeed where others would struggle. The boat burials with their nautical imagery might reflect not distant maritime origins, but deep cultural understanding of water's importance, spiritual beliefs that recognized rivers and seasonal waterways as the sources of life, identities built around their ability to find water, predict floods, manage irrigation in environments where water was scarce and precious. Whatever brought them to the Tarim Basin, whatever motivated their migration and enabled their settlement, they established a culture that persisted for over 1,000 years, that left hundreds of burials documenting their physical appearance and material culture and burial practices, that maintained genetic continuity through numerous generations before eventually beginning to show admixture with incoming populations during the Late Bronze Age and Iron Age. The genetic isolation didn't last forever, couldn't be maintained indefinitely as trade routes developed and population movements increased, and the Silk Road emerged connecting China to Central Asia to the Mediterranean. Later individuals from the region show mixed ancestry, show the kind of genetic patterns that make sense for a population living along trade routes that brought diverse peoples into contact. But during that early period, during the centuries when the mummies whose preservation is most remarkable were buried in their boat coffins beneath the desert sand, the Tarim population remained genetically distinct, remained the last best representatives of an Ice Age people, remained a puzzle that challenges our understanding of how human populations develop, migrate, maintain identity, and change across time. The question of language haunted the Tarim mummies from the moment their discovery became widely known. From the instant researchers realized they were looking at a population that didn't fit comfortably into any existing category, from the first attempts to connect these mysterious desert dwellers to the broader patterns of linguistic and cultural diffusion that supposedly characterized Bronze Age Eurasia. Language leaves no fossils, can rarely be reconstructed with confidence from material culture alone, and becomes increasingly difficult to trace the further back in time. One reaches beyond the advent of writing systems that preserve actual words and grammatical structures for direct analysis. But languages are not random, do not emerge in isolation, correlate with population movements, and cultural exchanges in ways that make them useful proxies for understanding human history, even when the genetic and archaeological records remain ambiguous or incomplete. The Tarim Basin, in later periods well documented through written records and archaeological evidence, was home to speakers of Tocharian languages, a branch of the Indo-European language family that was strikingly different from other Indo-European tongues, that preserved archaic features suggesting early divergence from the main Indo-European family tree, that occupied a geographic position far to the east of where scholars expected to find Indo-European languages during the first millennium CE, when the Tocharian texts that allow us to know the language existed were actually written. The Tocharian documents, discovered in the early 20th century in monasteries and caves along the northern edge of the Tarim Basin, were written in two distinct but related languages designated Tocharian A and Tocharian B by researchers, both using a script derived from the Brahmi writing system of India, both containing primarily Buddhist texts translated from Sanskrit, though some secular documents and administrative records also survived. The texts dated to roughly 500 to 900 CE, more than 2,000 years after the earliest Tarim mummies lived, spanning an enormous chronological gap that made direct connections speculative at best. Nevertheless, the discovery of Indo-European language spoken in the Tarim Basin prompted speculation that the mummies, with their Western physical features and their sophisticated textile technologies that seemed to echo European Bronze Age cultures, might have been the ancestors of the Tocharian speakers, might have brought Proto-Tocharian language to the region during their initial settlement around 2000 BCE, might represent the earliest evidence of Indo-European expansion into what is now Western China. This hypothesis was attractive, seemed to explain multiple puzzles simultaneously, appeared to connect disparate pieces of evidence into a coherent narrative where Indo-European-speaking pastoralists migrated from the western steppes into Central Asia, settled the oases of the Tarim Basin, maintained their language and some cultural practices while adapting to desert conditions, and eventually became the Tocharian speakers whose texts survive from the first millennium CE. The physical appearance of the mummies, their burial practices, their woolen textiles, all seemed consistent with Western origins, all fit the pattern of Indo-European expansion that had brought similar populations across vast territories from the Pontic steppes to South Asia to Northern Europe. But the genetic data destroyed this hypothesis completely, definitively, irrevocably. The early Tarim mummies showed no Indo-European ancestry, no genetic connection to the Yamnaya culture, whose expansion from the Pontic-Caspian steppes had spread Indo-European languages across much of Eurasia, no relationship to the Afanasyevo culture, who had brought Western steppe ancestry to the Altai region and surrounding areas. They were not migrants from the West, were not speakers of an early Indo-European language, could not have brought Proto-Tocharian to the Tarim Basin, because they had no genetic or cultural connection to Indo-European populations. The linguistic hypothesis required population movement, required that speakers of Proto-Tocharian actually physically migrated into the region carrying their language with them. Yet the genetics proved unambiguously that no such migration occurred, that the founding population of the Tarim Basin had deep local roots extending back to the Pleistocene, that whatever language they spoke, it wasn't Indo-European. This leaves the relationship between the early Tarim population and the later Tocharian speakers completely mysterious, transforms it from answered question back into open problem requiring new explanations and new evidence. Several possibilities present themselves, none entirely satisfactory, all requiring assumptions about population replacement, language shift, or chronological gaps that complicate rather than clarify the picture. Perhaps the early Tarim population was completely replaced by later migrants who brought Indo-European language to the region, perhaps during the late Bronze Age or Iron Age, when the genetic isolation that characterized the early period began breaking down and admixture with incoming populations became detectable in the archaeological record. The genetic studies show that later individuals from the Tarim Basin, those dating to after 1600 BCE, begin showing ancestry from Sintashta and Andronovo populations, the steppe cultures associated with Indo-European language spread, suggesting that migration did occur but centuries after the initial settlement and the period when the best-preserved mummies lived. Perhaps the early population abandoned their original language and adopted Indo-European speech through cultural contact and assimilation, perhaps as the region became increasingly integrated into networks connecting it to Indo-European speaking neighbors, perhaps as trade and interaction made learning Indo-European languages economically advantageous or socially necessary. Language shift without genetic replacement is well documented ethnographically, occurs when populations adopt the language of dominant neighbors or trading partners while maintaining their genetic identity, happens in contexts of cultural prestige, where one language becomes associated with literacy, religion, trade, or political power, and gradually displaces indigenous languages even without large-scale migration of new populations. The 2,000-year gap between the early mummies and the Tertiarian texts would have provided ample time for such language shift to occur, would allow for complex scenarios where multiple language changes happened, where the early Tarim population's original tongue was replaced first by one language and later by another, where the linguistic history became layered and complicated in ways that can't be reconstructed from the limited evidence available. Perhaps the connection between the early Tarim population and Tocharian speakers was minimal or non-existent. Perhaps they represent completely separate populations with no direct relationship beyond both having lived at different times in the same geographic region. The Tarim Basin wasn't densely populated, wasn't continuously occupied, experienced environmental changes that made different areas viable for settlement at different times, as rivers shifted course, as oases appeared and disappeared, as climate fluctuations affected water availability and agricultural potential. The early Bronze Age population might have declined or disappeared during periods of environmental stress, their settlements abandoned as water sources dried up or became unreliable, their numbers reduced through outmigration or elevated mortality until they no longer formed a viable population. Later populations moving into the region would have found evidence of earlier occupation, would have encountered the boat burial cemeteries standing as monuments to whoever had lived there previously, but wouldn't necessarily have any direct connection to those earlier inhabitants beyond geographic coincidence. The language question connects directly to broader debates about the relationship between genes, culture, and language, about whether these three aspects of human identity and heritage necessarily move together or can vary independently, about how much genetic ancestry research can tell us about other aspects of human history. The traditional assumption in archaeology and linguistics has been that language, genetic ancestry, and material culture generally correlate, that populations who share genetic ancestry typically share language and cultural practices, that migration of populations generally involves movement of genes, languages, and cultural traditions together as a package. This assumption has been reinforced by numerous case studies where genetic, linguistic, and archaeological evidence all point to the same conclusions, where population movements reconstructed from ancient DNA match linguistic reconstructions based on comparative philology and archaeological evidence of cultural change. But the Tarim mummies demonstrate that this correlation is not absolute, that genetic isolation can coexist with cultural cosmopolitanism, that populations can adopt technologies and practices from neighbors without adopting their genes, that the relationship between ancestry and culture is complex and can't be reduced to simple equations. They maintained ancient North Eurasian genetic heritage while adopting wheat agriculture that originated in the Fertile Crescent, while practicing dairy pastoralism that spread from the western steppes, while using textile techniques that showed connections to distant cultures, while living in ways that looked culturally similar to their Bronze Age contemporaries across Central Asia despite being genetically distinct from all of them. This pattern forces reconsideration of how we interpret archaeological evidence, requires acknowledging that material culture alone cannot definitively answer questions about population origins, demonstrates that ancient populations were capable of borrowing, adapting, and innovating in ways that created cultural similarities across genetic boundaries. The implications extend beyond just the Tarim Basin, affect how researchers interpret evidence from other regions and periods, suggest that many archaeological puzzles might result from assuming too close a correlation between genes and culture, when in fact the relationship was more complex? How many other supposedly migrant populations might actually represent local groups who adopted foreign cultural practices? How many supposedly continuous cultural traditions might mask genetic discontinuities where population replacement occurred, but material culture remained relatively stable because newcomers adopted local practices? How many linguistic boundaries corresponded to genetic boundaries, and how many language shifts occurred without corresponding genetic changes? The Tarim case proves that these questions can't be answered through material culture alone, require genetic evidence to distinguish between migration and cultural adoption, demonstrate that reconstructing ancient population history demands multiple lines of evidence that can reveal when genes, culture, and language moved together and when they didn't. The discovery that the early Tarim population had adopted dairy pastoralism, despite being genetically isolated, was particularly significant, particularly revealing about how technologies spread in the ancient world, particularly clear evidence that they were not completely cut off from their neighbors despite maintaining genetic boundaries. The proteomic analysis of dental calculus from 7 individuals buried at Xiaohe between 2000 and 1700 BCI showed unambiguous evidence of milk proteins from cattle, sheep, and goats, proved that these individuals consumed dairy products regularly enough that milk proteins became incorporated into the calcified plaque on their teeth, demonstrated that dairy pastoralism was established in the Tarim Basin from the earliest periods of settlement rather than being adopted later. The milk proteins could even be identified to species level, showing that the Tarim people were using multiple types of livestock for dairy production, were exploiting cattle and sheep and goats, were managing herds that provided them with regular milk supplies that they processed into cheese and kefir and other preserved forms. Dairy pastoralism is not something that can be independently invented, is not an obvious or intuitive use of livestock, requires specific knowledge about milking animals, about processing milk to make it storable and transportable, about the bacterial cultures necessary for fermentation that transforms raw milk into cheese and yogurt and kefir. Cattle, sheep, and goats don't naturally produce more milk than their offspring require unless humans selectively breed them for dairy production, unless humans manage their reproduction to ensure continuous lactation, unless humans have developed the handling techniques necessary to milk animals without injuring them or triggering defensive responses. The entire complex of dairy pastoralism represents accumulated knowledge, generations of experimentation and refinement, cultural traditions about animal management and food processing that must be transmitted through teaching and learning rather than being rediscovered independently in each population. The fact that the genetically isolated Tarim population had this knowledge proves definitively that they were in contact with populations who already practiced dairy pastoralism, proves that they learned these techniques from neighbors, proves that cultural exchange was occurring even as genetic exchange was somehow prevented or minimized. The nearest populations who practiced dairy pastoralism during this period were the steppe cultures to the north and west, the descendants of the Yamnaya expansion who had brought lactase persistence genes and dairy-focused economies across vast territories, the Afanasyevo and Sintashta and Andronovo cultures whose genetic signatures appeared in neighboring regions, but not during the early period in the Tarim Basin itself. Somehow the Tarim people had learned dairy techniques from these neighbors without intermarrying with them in numbers sufficient to leave detectable genetic traces, had acquired livestock that must have originally come from domesticated herds originating elsewhere, had learned to make kefir using bacterial cultures that they must have received from populations who already used those cultures. The absence of lactase persistence genes in the Tarim population was equally revealing, equally significant for understanding both their history and the broader patterns of dairy pastoralism evolution in Asia. Lactase persistence, the genetic mutation that allows adults to digest lactose in milk without experiencing gastrointestinal distress, evolved independently multiple times in populations that practiced dairy pastoralism, providing strong selective advantage in contexts where milk formed a major dietary component. In European populations, lactase persistence became nearly universal, swept to high frequencies through positive selection because the ability to digest fresh milk provided significant nutritional benefits. But in many Asian populations that also practiced dairy pastoralism, lactase persistence remained rare or absent because these populations relied primarily on fermented dairy products like yogurt and cheese and kefir, where bacterial fermentation breaks down lactose before consumption, making the products digestible for people who lack lactase persistence genes. The Tarim Mummies fit this Asian pattern, had adopted dairy pastoralism but processed their milk products through fermentation, were making kefir cheese rather than drinking fresh milk, were using techniques that allowed them to exploit dairy resources without requiring genetic adaptation for lactose digestion. This suggests they learned dairy pastoralism from populations who were already using fermentation techniques, who had adapted to dairy consumption through cultural innovations rather than or in addition to genetic changes, who taught the Tarim people specifically the fermentation methods rather than simply introducing them to the concept of using animal milk for food. The specificity of this cultural transmission, the fact that they adopted particular processing techniques along with dairy pastoralism itself, provides evidence of meaningful contact, of sustained interaction sufficient for complex knowledge to be transmitted, of relationships with neighboring populations that went beyond occasional chance encounters. Yet despite this evidence of contact, despite the clear proof that the Tarim population was learning from neighbors and adopting foreign technologies, the genetic isolation persisted through multiple centuries, through the entire early Bronze Age period represented by the best-preserved mummies, through generations of people who were practicing essentially the same economic activities, living in similar ways, facing similar challenges as their steppe neighbors to the north who showed completely different genetic profiles. The paradox remained unresolved, inexplicable through simple models, frustrating in its refusal to fit neat categories or straightforward explanations. The genetic isolation that characterized the early Tarim population didn't last forever, couldn't persist indefinitely in a world where Bronze Age cultures were increasingly interconnected, where trade networks were expanding, where population movements were accelerating, where the forces driving admixture and cultural exchange were becoming too powerful to resist even in remote desert oases that had somehow maintained their separateness for centuries. The later individuals analyzed in genetic studies, those dating to the late Bronze Age and Iron Age periods after roughly 1600 BCE, began showing different ancestry profiles, began displaying genetic signatures that the earlier mummies had conspicuously lacked, began demonstrating that the boundaries that had preserved ancient North Eurasian genetic heritage in pure or nearly pure form were finally breaking down, finally becoming permeable, finally allowing the mixing that logic and geography suggested should have been happening all along. The transformation wasn't sudden, wasn't a dramatic replacement event where one population disappeared and another arrived fully formed to take their place, but rather a gradual process of admixture where incoming genetic ancestry mixed with the existing population, where the distinctive ANE genetic profile became diluted through intermarriage with people carrying different ancestries, where the genetic isolation that had been so remarkable during the early Bronze Age gave way to the kind of genetic complexity that characterized most of Central Asia during this period. A genetic study published in 2025 examined individuals from a late Bronze Age site in the western Tarim Basin, dated to 1600 to 1400 BCE, and found a population whose ancestry was dramatically different from the Xiaohe Horizon mummies, who had lived just a few centuries earlier and only a few hundred kilometers away. These later individuals showed overwhelming ancestry from Sintashta and Andronovo populations, the steppe cultures associated with Indo-European language spread and the expansion of pastoral economies across Central Asia, with additional smaller components from BMAC populations to the west and from the early Tarim population itself. Only 12% of the genetic ancestry in these late Bronze Age individuals could be traced to the early Tarim population, suggesting that whatever demographic process had brought Sintashta and Andronovo ancestry to the western Tarim Basin had involved substantial population movement, had brought enough people with steppe ancestry that they numerically overwhelmed the existing population, had transformed the genetic landscape of the region through migration rather than through gradual admixture between roughly equal populations. The Y chromosome data reinforced this picture, showing that nearly all the late Bronze Age males belonged to haplogroup RM417, the paternal lineage strongly associated with Indo-European expansions, the genetic marker that characterized corded ware, Sintashta, Andronovo, and other steppe-related cultures. This pattern suggested that males from steppe populations had migrated into the Tarim Basin and had become the dominant paternal lineage, either through numerical superiority, through social structures that gave them reproductive advantages, or through demographic processes that favored the survival and reproduction of steppe-descended families over those descended from the earlier population. The 12% Tarim ancestry that did persist in these later individuals proved that the process wasn't complete genocide, wasn't total replacement, where the earlier population was eliminated entirely, but rather represented substantial but incomplete admixture, where some individuals from the earlier population or their descendants continued to contribute genetically to later generations, even as the population's overall genetic composition shifted dramatically. This pattern of partial replacement, combined with partial continuity, appears frequently in the archaeological and genetic record of Bronze Age Eurasia, seems to represent a common outcome when populations with different economic strategies, different social organizations, or different technological capabilities came into contact and competition. The newcomers didn't necessarily kill or expel everyone who was already there, but they did become demographically dominant, did contribute most of the genetic ancestry to subsequent generations, did transform the genetic landscape while still incorporating some continuity with earlier inhabitants. The question of what happened to the early Tarim population, where their descendants went if they weren't entirely absorbed into the newcomer population, whether they migrated elsewhere or declined demographically in place, remains partially unanswered, obscured by the limited sampling of ancient individuals and the challenges of reconstructing population dynamics from sparse genetic data. But intriguingly, genetic studies of modern Central Asian populations have detected traces of early Tarim ancestry, have found that this distinctive ancient North Eurasian genetic profile didn't disappear completely, but rather persists at low frequencies in some contemporary groups, particularly in highland populations of Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, where geographic isolation and unique demographic histories may have preserved genetic variation that has been lost elsewhere. A 2022 study titled Genetic Echo of the Tarim Mummies in Modern Central Asians specifically investigated this question, analyzed whole genome sequences from Tajik and Kyrgyz populations, and found that highland Tajik groups show evidence of gene flow from Tarim mummy-related populations dating to approximately 3,000 to 3,600 years ago. This discovery was remarkable, unexpected, significant for demonstrating that the early Tarim population's genetic legacy didn't end when their culture disappeared from the archaeological record, that their descendants, or at least some of them, migrated out of the Tarim Basin and contributed to populations in the surrounding mountain regions, that the ancient North Eurasian ancestry they carried continued to be transmitted through subsequent generations, even as it became increasingly diluted through mixing with other populations. The Sarikoli Tajik and Pamiri Tajik populations, who live in the high mountain valleys of the Pamir Plateau, at elevations where agriculture is difficult and populations have historically been small and relatively isolated, show the strongest signals of this Tarim-related ancestry, carry genetic signatures that connect them to the mummies whose preserved bodies still lie in museums and storage facilities across China, represent living links to a population that existed 4,000 years ago and whose story seemed to have ended when their genetic isolation broke down during the late Bronze Age. The maternal lineage data reinforced these connections, showed that mitochondrial DNA haplogroup C4, which was characteristic of the early Tarim mummies, appears in modern Tajik and Kyrgyz populations, demonstrating that females from the early Tarim population or their descendants contributed to the genetic ancestry of these modern groups, that the connections aren't just abstract statistical patterns in autosomal DNA, but include specific maternal lineages that can be traced through time. The preservation of these genetic echoes in modern populations provides evidence that population replacement in the ancient world, even when substantial, was rarely absolute, rarely involved complete elimination of earlier inhabitants, more commonly resulted in complex demographic outcomes where earlier populations were numerically reduced but not entirely eliminated, were absorbed into expanding populations but left genetic traces that could persist for millennia if demographic conditions allowed. But if some early Tarim individuals or their descendants migrated into mountain regions where traces of their ancestry can still be detected today, others presumably remained in the Tarim Basin, presumably were among the ancestors of the later populations who showed mixed ancestry, presumably contributed to the genetic and cultural complexity that characterized the region during subsequent periods. The Tarim Basin didn't become empty after the genetic isolation broke down, didn't lose its population and have to be recolonized from scratch, but rather underwent demographic transformation where population composition changed while settlement continuity persisted. The boat burial traditions that characterized the early Xiaohe horizon don't appear in later periods with the same frequency or the same elaborate forms, suggesting cultural discontinuity, suggesting that the people who brought Sintashta and Andronovo ancestry also brought different burial practices, different spiritual beliefs, different ways of treating and commemorating the dead. But agricultural and pastoral economies continued, oasis settlements continued to be occupied, the fundamental pattern of human adaptation to desert conditions continued even as the people doing the adapting changed genetically and culturally. The arrival of steppe-related populations in the Tarim Basin during the Late Bronze Age probably represents the period when Indo-European languages first became established in the region, the demographic event that eventually led to Tocharian languages being spoken there during the first millennium CE, when written records finally document linguistic evidence. This connection between genetic ancestry and language remains speculative, can't be proven definitively from archaeological and genetic data alone, but represents the most plausible explanation for how Indo-European speech reached the Tarim Basin, given that the early population clearly wasn't Indo-European speaking, and that later populations show substantial ancestry from steppe groups strongly associated with Indo-European language dispersal. The 2,000-year gap between the arrival of steppe ancestry and the Tocharian texts remains problematic, requires assuming linguistic continuity across many generations for which we have no direct documentation, leaves open possibilities of additional language changes that occurred during that interval and aren't captured in the limited textual record. The Tocharian languages themselves, when they finally do appear in written form, show characteristics that suggest long separation from other Indo-European languages that indicate they diverged from the main Indo-European family tree early and then evolved in relative isolation, that preserved archaic features that had been lost in most other Indo-European branches, while also developing unique innovations that reflected their Central Asian environment and cultural context. Some linguists have argued that Tocharian represents one of the earliest branches to separate from Proto-Indo-European, that its distinctive features resulted from diverging before many of the innovations that characterized other Indo-European groups had occurred, that its speakers were among the first groups to migrate away from the Indo-European homeland wherever that was located. If this reconstruction is correct, if Tocharian does represent an early divergence, then perhaps the Sintashta and Andronovo populations, who brought Indo-European ancestry to the Tarim Basin during the Late Bronze Age, were already speaking a form of Proto-Tocharian, were already linguistically distinctive from their steppe relatives, were carrying a language that had itself been evolving in isolation or semi-isolation for centuries before reaching the desert oases, where it would eventually be documented in Buddhist texts. But these linguistic reconstructions remain contentious, depend on assumptions about rates of language change and patterns of linguistic innovation that are difficult to verify, rest on limited textual evidence that provides only a snapshot of what Tocharian languages looked like during a few centuries in the first millennium CE, without revealing their earlier history or their relationships to other languages during the periods before writing was adopted. The genetic evidence can tell us that people with steppe ancestry arrived in the Tarim Basin around 1600 BCE, can demonstrate that these newcomers became demographically dominant, can show that modern populations carry traces of both the early Tarim people and the later arrivals, but it cannot tell us what languages any of these populations spoke, cannot definitively connect genetic ancestry to linguistic identity, cannot resolve debates about Tocharian origins that must ultimately be addressed through linguistic analysis combined with careful consideration of the archaeological and genetic context. What the genetic evidence does accomplish, what it demonstrates beyond reasonable doubt, is that the human history of the Tarim Basin was far more complex than earlier scholars had imagined, that simple models of migration and cultural transmission cannot capture the reality of how populations interacted and transformed across the Bronze Age, that the mummies whose preservation allows us to see their faces and examine their clothing and analyze their DNA represent multiple populations with different origins and different histories who successively occupied the same desert environment. The early Tarim people, with their ancient North Eurasian ancestry and their remarkable genetic isolation, represent one chapter in this history, perhaps the most mysterious and most remarkable chapter, but not the only one. The later arrivals with their steppe ancestry represent another chapter, one that connects the Tarim Basin to the broader patterns of Indo-European expansion and cultural transformation that characterized Bronze Age Eurasia. Modern populations with their complex mixed ancestries and their faint genetic echoes of ancient populations represent yet another chapter, demonstrating that the story didn't end in the ancient past but continues to unfold through subsequent generations. The preservation of the early mummies, the accident of desert conditions that kept their bodies intact for 4,000 years, the discovery of their burials at a historical moment when genetic technology could finally answer questions about their origins, all combined to provide unprecedented insight into this ancient population, to reveal the paradox of their genetic isolation combined with cultural cosmopolitanism, to document their physical appearance and material culture and dietary practices with extraordinary detail. Without the mummies, without their preserved DNA and clothing and burial goods, we might never have known that an ancient North Eurasian population survived into the Bronze Age, might never have understood that genetic isolation was possible even in regions where cultural exchange was clearly occurring, might never have been forced to reconsider our assumptions about the relationships between genes and culture and language in the ancient world. The political dimensions of the Tarim mummies' discovery and study have been inseparable from the scientific questions since the moment Chinese archaeologists first realized they were excavating bodies that didn't fit comfortable narratives about who had lived in Xinjiang during ancient times, that challenged simplistic stories about continuous Han Chinese presence in the region, that complicated claims about the historical relationship between China's government and the territories along its western frontier. The mummies became political symbols almost immediately, were claimed by different groups to support different narratives about indigenous identity and historical legitimacy, became evidence in contemporary debates about autonomy and repression, and cultural identity that had nothing to do with Bronze Age population dynamics, but everything to do with modern power and resistance, and the uses of history in service of political agendas. The Uyghur people, a Turkic-speaking Muslim population who constitute the largest ethnic group in Xinjiang today, seized upon the mummies as proof of their status as the region's indigenous inhabitants, as evidence that their ancestors had lived in the Tarim Basin for thousands of years before Han Chinese expansion brought the region under imperial control, as justification for claims that Xinjiang should properly be called East Turkestan and should enjoy autonomy or independence rather than remaining under Beijing's administration. The fact that the earliest mummies had European features, that they didn't look East Asian, was interpreted not as evidence against Uyghur indigeneity, but rather as evidence of the region's historical connections to Central Asian populations, to the Turkic and Indo-European peoples who had migrated across the steppes and mountains, to cultural spheres that looked west toward Persia and Europe rather than east toward China. Uyghur activists and intellectuals pointed to the mummies in museums, to the preserved faces with their high cheekbones and narrow noses, to the woolen textiles and wheat-based agriculture, and argued that Xinjiang's history was fundamentally different from China's, that the region had never been truly Chinese, that modern Chinese control was colonial occupation of territory that belonged to different peoples with different histories. The Chinese government responded with a combination of scientific counter-argument, bureaucratic control of access to the mummies and to research sites, and increasingly aggressive attempts to manage the narrative around Xinjiang's history and the ethnic composition of its ancient populations. Officials emphasized that genetic studies showed the Tarim mummies were not direct ancestors of modern Uyghurs, that the Uyghur people themselves didn't arrive in the region until the 9th century CE, when Turkic migrations brought them from further north and west, that claiming continuity between Bronze Age populations and contemporary ethnic groups required selective reading of the evidence that ignored the multiple population replacements and demographic transformations that had occurred across 3,000 years. The argument was technically correct, was supported by the genetic data showing that modern Uyghurs have complex mixed ancestry derived from many sources, including but not limited to the ancient Tarim populations, but it was deployed in service of a political agenda that sought to delegitimize Uyghur claims to special status or historical priority in the region. Chinese authorities also restricted foreign researchers' access to the mummies, made it increasingly difficult for international teams to obtain the samples necessary for genetic analysis, imposed bureaucratic obstacles that delayed or prevented studies that might produce results politically inconvenient for Beijing's narrative. Victor Mayer, the American archaeologist who had been instrumental in bringing international attention to the mummies during the 1990s, found himself progressively shut out of research opportunities, watched as Chinese officials who had previously welcomed his involvement became distant or hostile, experienced the frustration of seeing fascinating archaeological questions remain unaddressed because political considerations took precedence over scientific inquiry. The genetic studies that finally did occur, that produced the revelations about ancient North Eurasian ancestry and genetic isolation, happened only after years of negotiation and only with substantial Chinese institutional involvement that ensured Beijing maintained some control over how results were interpreted and presented. The political sensitivity intensified as China's policies in Xinjiang became increasingly repressive during the 2010s and 2020s, as reports emerged of mass detention camps, forced labor, cultural suppression, and systematic attempts to erase Uyghur identity through assimilation programs that critics characterized as cultural genocide. The Tarim mummies, in this context, became more than just archaeological curiosities, became symbols of resistance and evidence of historical distinctiveness that the Chinese government apparently wanted to minimize or erase, just as it was attempting to minimize or erase contemporary Uyghur culture. Museums that displayed the mummies received instructions to modify their presentations, to emphasize that these were simply ancient inhabitants of Chinese territory, to downplay suggestions that they represented different ethnic or cultural traditions from Han Chinese civilization. Some exhibits were modified or closed entirely, access was restricted, and the mummies gradually disappeared from public view as political considerations overwhelmed scientific and educational purposes. The irony was that the genetic evidence, properly understood, didn't actually support either the Uyghur narrative of direct descent from the earliest Tarim populations or the Chinese narrative that the region had always been fundamentally Chinese. Instead, the DNA revealed something more complex, more interesting, more challenging to simplistic political narratives than either side wanted to acknowledge. The early Tarim population was indeed indigenous to Central Asia, broadly conceived, was not Han Chinese, was not even distantly related to East Asian populations, represented ancient inhabitants who had lived in the region before the historical period when Chinese imperial power began expanding westward. But they also weren't Uyghur ancestors in any direct sense, weren't Turkic speakers, weren't Muslims, represented a completely different population whose language and culture and identity had been lost long before the Uyghurs arrived, whose genetic legacy survived only as traces in modern mountain populations far from the Tarim Basin itself. The later populations, the ones who brought Sintashta and Andronovo ancestry during the late Bronze Age, were probably Indo-European speakers, were probably ancestral to the Tocharians who would later inhabit the region, represented migrations from the western steppes that connected the Tarim Basin to broader Eurasian population movements. But they weren't Uyghur ancestors either, weren't Turkic, came thousands of years before Turkic languages or Islamic religion reached Central Asia. The Iron Age and historical period populations showed increasingly complex mixing, incorporated ancestry from many sources including Tibetan plateau populations, East Asian groups, and continuing inflows from the steppes, creating the genetic diversity that would eventually contribute to modern populations, including but not limited to the Uyghurs. No single modern group could claim exclusive descent from ancient Tarim populations. No contemporary ethnic identity mapped neatly onto Bronze Age genetic patterns. No political agenda was fully supported by the scientific evidence once that evidence was examined carefully and completely. But political discourse rarely embraces complexity, rarely acknowledges that histories don't support simple narratives of continuous ethnic identity stretching back thousands of years, rarely admits that modern political boundaries and ethnic categories are recent constructions that can't be projected backward onto ancient populations who had different identities, different languages, different cultural affiliations that don't correspond to contemporary divisions. Both Uyghur activists and Chinese officials preferred their simplified stories, preferred histories that supported their political positions, preferred to use the mummies as symbols rather than as evidence requiring careful interpretation and nuanced understanding. The result was that serious scholarly discussion of the Tarim mummies became increasingly difficult, became entangled in political debates that had little to do with Bronze Age population dynamics, became another casualty of the broader conflict over Xinjiang's present and future rather than its past. Western researchers found themselves in uncomfortable positions, wanting to pursue scientific questions about ancient populations, while aware that their work would inevitably be interpreted through political lenses, that genetic data would be misused to support political arguments, regardless of how carefully they qualified their conclusions, that simply conducting research on Xinjiang's ancient populations could be construed as taking sides in contemporary conflicts. Some withdrew from Tarim research entirely, decided the political complications weren't worth the scientific benefits, focused their attention on other regions where archaeological work didn't require navigating ethnic tensions and governmental restrictions. Others persisted, argued that abandoning the research would mean allowing political considerations to determine which scientific questions could be addressed, insisted that understanding human history was important enough to justify continuing work despite the challenges. The 2021 genetic study that revealed the Tarim mummies' ancient North Eurasian ancestry and genetic isolation was careful in its language, cautious in its interpretations, scrupulous about avoiding political implications while presenting the scientific findings. The authors emphasized that their results demonstrated the complexity of ancient population history, that they showed genetic ancestry didn't necessarily correlate with cultural practices or linguistic identity, that they revealed patterns of migration and isolation that didn't fit simple narratives about ethnic continuity or cultural transmission. They noted that the early Tarim population's genetic isolation, combined with cultural cosmopolitanism, challenged assumptions about how ancient societies developed, provided evidence that gene flow and cultural exchange could vary independently, demonstrated that populations could maintain genetic boundaries while still participating in regional networks of trade and knowledge transmission. These careful framings didn't prevent the study from being claimed by various groups to support their preferred narratives, didn't stop both Chinese media and Uyghur diaspora publications from selectively emphasizing whichever aspects of the findings seemed to support their positions while ignoring contradictory evidence. Chinese reports emphasized that the mummies weren't Indo-European migrants, weren't related to Western populations, were indigenous in ways that implicitly connected them to Chinese rather than Turkic or Western claims. Uyghur sources emphasized that the mummies showed no Han Chinese ancestry, that they represented populations distinct from East Asian groups, that Xinjiang's ancient history was fundamentally different from China proper. Neither interpretation was entirely wrong, neither was entirely honest about the full complexity of the evidence, and both demonstrated how scientific findings about ancient populations inevitably become entangled in contemporary politics regardless of researchers' intentions or careful qualifications. The debate over who owned the mummies, who had rights to study them, where they should be displayed, and how their history should be presented became increasingly fraught as China's treatment of Uyghurs attracted international condemnation, and as Western institutions reconsidered their relationships with Chinese academic and cultural organizations. Museums that held Tarim mummy exhibits faced pressure from human rights activists to close those exhibits in protest of Chinese policies, faced counter-pressure from Chinese officials threatening to withdraw cooperation if exhibits presented narratives that Beijing found problematic, found themselves trying to navigate impossible positions where any choice would offend someone, and where the mummies themselves became pawns in geopolitical conflicts having nothing to do with Bronze Age archaeology. Some institutions chose to simply remove the mummies from display, to store them away where they wouldn't provoke controversy, effectively ensuring that public engagement with this remarkable archaeological discovery became impossible because the political complications were too difficult to manage. The restrictions on research extended beyond just access to the mummies themselves, affected ability to conduct new excavations in the Tarim Basin, limited opportunities to discover additional sites that might provide more evidence about Bronze Age populations and their cultural practices. The Xiaohe Cemetery, despite being partially excavated, still contains hundreds of burials that haven't been systematically investigated, still holds potential for revealing more about the population that created those enigmatic boat burials and those towering pole markers. Other cemeteries scattered across the basin remain unexcavated or incompletely studied, might preserve mummies with even better condition than those already recovered, might contain artifacts or burial goods that would illuminate aspects of Tarim culture that current evidence leaves obscure. But conducting new excavations requires permits that Chinese authorities are increasingly reluctant to grant, requires international collaboration that political tensions make difficult, requires funding that becomes harder to justify when prospects for actually completing research and publishing results are uncertain. The tragedy is that the Tarim mummies represent irreplaceable evidence about human history, about population movements and cultural exchanges and adaptive strategies during the Bronze Age, about how humans survived in marginal environments and maintained identity across generations, about the complex relationships between genetic ancestry and cultural practice that characterized ancient Eurasia. These questions transcend contemporary political conflicts, matter regardless of who currently controls Xinjiang, or what policies governments implement, or how ethnic tensions play out in the 21st century. But accessing that evidence, learning from those mummies, answering those questions, has become hostage to politics in ways that seem likely to persist for the foreseeable future, that represent a loss not just for archaeology, but for human knowledge more broadly. The environmental context in which the Tarim mummies lived, thrived, and eventually disappeared is as remarkable as the mummies themselves, represents one of the most challenging human habitats on Earth, demands explanation for how Bronze Age populations without modern technology managed not merely to survive, but to establish sophisticated agricultural and pastoral economies in conditions that kill the unprepared, and that test even modern travelers equipped with vehicles, maps, communications equipment, and emergency rescue systems. The Taklamakan Desert, which occupies much of the Tarim Basin, stretches across roughly 337,000 square kilometers of the most inhospitable terrain in Central Asia, ranks among the world's largest sandy deserts, experiences temperature extremes ranging from -40 degrees Celsius in winter to over 40 degrees Celsius in summer, and receives less than 40 millimeters of annual precipitation across most of its extent. The name itself, variously translated as place of no return or go in and you won't come out, reflects centuries of accumulated knowledge about the dangers this environment poses, the frequency with which travelers have disappeared into the dunes never to emerge, the respect and fear that local populations have maintained toward this vast sea of sand. Yet 4,000 years ago, when the climate was different but not fundamentally more hospitable, when the Tarim Basin wasn't lush paradise, but rather already arid, though perhaps slightly less extreme than today, populations not only entered this forbidding landscape, but settled permanently, established communities that persisted for centuries, developed economic systems based on agriculture and animal husbandry that required reliable water sources and adequate pasture, created the cultural traditions and burial practices that the mummified remains now document. The apparent contradiction between environmental hostility and successful human habitation resolves when one understands that the Tarim Basin, despite being dominated by desert, wasn't uniformly barren, wasn't completely without water, wasn't devoid of the resources necessary for human survival if one knew where to look and how to exploit marginal opportunities that more fertile regions would render unnecessary to master. The key to understanding Bronze Age settlement in the Tarim Basin lies in recognizing the importance of rivers flowing down from the surrounding mountains, the Kunlun Range to the south and the Tian Shan to the north, carrying snowmelt and glacial melt that provided seasonal or permanent water sources along the desert margins and in particular locations where rivers emerged from mountain valleys onto the basin floor. These rivers didn't flow year-round in all cases, didn't maintain constant courses across the shifting sands, didn't provide the kind of reliable hydrology that supported dense agricultural settlements in more favorable regions, but they did create oases, temporary or permanent green zones where vegetation could grow, where animals could graze, where humans could cultivate crops if they understood the environmental dynamics and adapted their practices accordingly. The archaeological evidence shows that early Tarim populations concentrated their settlements precisely in these oasis locations, built their communities along riverbanks or near springs, positioned themselves to exploit the ephemeral water resources that made life possible in an otherwise deadly environment. But rivers in desert regions are unreliable, shift course frequently as sand accumulation redirects flows, disappear entirely when drought reduces mountain snowpack, or when climate variations alter precipitation patterns, create dynamic landscapes where settlements viable in one generation might be abandoned in the next when water sources dried up or moved beyond practical distance. The archaeological sites scattered across the Tarim Basin show exactly this pattern. Settlements occupied for periods of decades or centuries then abandoned, populations moving to follow water rather than attempting to maintain communities in locations that had become uninhabitable, creating a settlement pattern that was stable at the population level but dynamic at the individual site level as people constantly adapted to environmental changes that rendered some oases unusable while opening opportunities at others. The boat burials themselves might reflect this environmental reality, might symbolize the journeys that populations undertook across the desert seeking viable settlement locations, might represent spiritual beliefs about death as a voyage comparable to the physical voyages that characterized life. The agricultural practices documented through preserved plant remains show sophisticated adaptation to desert conditions, show selection of crops suited to arid environments with limited growing seasons, show understanding of irrigation techniques that could extend the natural water availability and support cultivation in locations where rainfall alone would be completely insufficient. Wheat and barley, the primary grains found in Tarim Basin archaeological sites, are relatively drought-tolerant crops that can produce harvests with minimal water if properly managed, that have shorter growing seasons than rice or other water-intensive crops, that made sense for populations operating at the margins of agricultural viability. Millet, also found in Tarim sites, is even more drought-tolerant, can grow in sandy soils, matures quickly, and provides insurance against complete crop failure in years when water is particularly scarce. The combination of these crops shows risk management, shows strategies for ensuring some harvest even in difficult years, shows the kind of environmental knowledge that comes only from generations of experience and careful observation of which plants succeed and which fail in marginal conditions. The presence of irrigation systems, documented through archaeological survey and excavation at multiple Tarim Basin sites, demonstrates that these populations weren't simply opportunistically exploiting naturally watered areas, but were actively managing water resources, were digging channels to direct water from rivers to fields, were probably also digging wells to access groundwater where rivers were unreliable or seasonal, were investing labor in infrastructure that would allow agriculture to succeed where it would otherwise fail. Building and maintaining irrigation systems in desert conditions requires collective organization, requires communities working together rather than families operating independently, requires social structures capable of coordinating labor and managing the critical resource on which everyone depends, suggests that Tarim Basin populations had developed the kind of political organization and social cohesion necessary for managing common pool resources in conditions where individual household strategies would be inadequate. The pastoral component of the Tarim economy was equally important, equally demanding of environmental knowledge, equally dependent on understanding the dynamics of a landscape where resources were scarce and unpredictably distributed. Cattle, sheep, and goats require pasture, require water, require management that moves herds to follow grass growth through seasonal cycles, that prevents overgrazing that would destroy pasture permanently, that balances herd sizes against carrying capacity of available resources. In the Tarim Basin environment, pastoralism necessarily involved transhumance, involved moving animals between different elevational zones and different ecological niches as seasons changed, involved sending portions of the population away from main settlements to accompany herds while others remained at oases to tend crops, involved complex coordination between the agricultural and pastoral components of the economy. The genetic evidence that Tarim populations practiced dairy pastoralism from their earliest presence in the basin shows they brought this knowledge with them, had already mastered the techniques necessary for managing herds in challenging environments before settling the desert oases, possessed cultural traditions about animal husbandry that proved transferable to their new environment. But perhaps most remarkably, the Tarim populations managed not just to survive in this harsh environment, but to thrive sufficiently that they could invest resources in elaborate burial practices, could afford to construct boat-shaped wooden coffins requiring substantial timber that had to be transported from mountain forests, could erect massive wooden poles as grave markers consuming additional timber, could include grave goods like woven textiles and preserved food and cattle sacrifices that represented significant wealth, could maintain burial grounds serving communities over multiple generations rather than being forced into purely utilitarian treatment of the dead, where corpses were disposed of with minimal ceremony because survival required all available labor and resources. The cemeteries themselves demonstrate that these weren't populations constantly on the edge of starvation, weren't struggling so desperately that every individual had to contribute maximally to resource acquisition, but rather had achieved sufficient economic stability and productivity that they could support cultural practices that consumed resources without directly contributing to survival. The preservation of the mummies itself resulted from environmental conditions, from the extreme aridity that prevented bacterial decomposition, from the combination of high daytime temperatures and low nighttime temperatures that rapidly desiccated bodies, from burial practices that placed bodies in wooden coffins covered with cattle hides that provided some protection from scavenging animals while allowing gradual drying. But preservation also required that the burials themselves remained undisturbed across thousands of years, required that the desert environment that killed living inhabitants also protected dead ones, required that sand accumulation buried the cemeteries and created the stable conditions necessary for organic materials to survive. Many other Bronze Age populations created elaborate burials, many other cultures invested resources in honoring their dead, but the vast majority of those burials provided conditions where bodies decayed completely, where only skeletons survived, where the faces and hair and clothing and soft tissue that make the Tarim mummies so immediately human were lost to decomposition within years or decades of burial. The climate during the Bronze Age in the Tarim Basin appears to have been somewhat wetter than today, though the evidence remains debated and the degree of difference is difficult to quantify with precision. Paleoclimatic reconstructions based on lake levels, vegetation patterns preserved in sediment cores, and historical records from later periods suggest that around 2000 BCE, when the earliest Tarim populations established their settlements, the region received slightly more precipitation than in recent centuries, that rivers flowed more reliably, that some areas now completely barren supported sparse vegetation, that the environmental margin for human habitation was slightly less narrow than it would later become. But the difference shouldn't be exaggerated, shouldn't be imagined as transformation from desert to grassland or from arid to humid, but rather as modest amelioration that made marginal environments slightly less marginal, that expanded the geographic extent where oasis agriculture could succeed, that allowed populations to establish themselves in locations that would become uninhabitable once climate shifted toward greater aridity during subsequent millennia. The environmental deterioration that occurred during the late Bronze Age and Iron Age as the climate became progressively drier and as rivers shifted course or diminished in flow probably contributed to the demographic changes documented in the genetic evidence, probably forced population movements as settlements became unviable, probably created conditions where incoming populations with different economic strategies or different environmental knowledge could successfully compete with established inhabitants who had adapted to earlier conditions. The exact causal relationships between environmental change and population replacement remain unclear, can't be definitively reconstructed from the available evidence, might have involved complex feedback loops where environmental stress weakened established populations, making them vulnerable to displacement by newcomers, or where changing conditions favored the economic strategies that newcomers brought with them, or where deteriorating environments prompted outmigration by some established inhabitants, creating vacuums that newcomers filled. The ultimate abandonment of many Bronze Age and Iron Age settlements in the Tarim Basin, the archaeological evidence of sites occupied for centuries, then left empty, the transformation of once viable oases into barren locations where nothing grows and where the ruins of earlier occupation stand as monuments to past human presence, all demonstrate that the environmental margin for human habitation in this region was never secure, was always vulnerable to changes in water availability that could render entire settlement systems obsolete. The modern Tarim Basin contains numerous such abandoned sites, ancient cities whose ruins emerge from the sand, irrigation systems whose channels can still be traced across now barren landscapes, cemeteries like Xiaohe whose burials were protected by the same sand that covered the evidence of the living communities that created them. These sites serve as reminders that human occupation of marginal environments is always provisional, always dependent on environmental conditions that can change, always vulnerable to the kind of collapse that can transform thriving communities into archaeological sites within a few generations. Yet the Tarim Basin wasn't permanently abandoned, didn't become completely uninhabitable, continued to support human populations through subsequent periods, including the historical era, when the Silk Road made the region economically important as a corridor connecting China to Central Asia and beyond. The oases that supported Bronze Age populations continued to support later populations. The environmental knowledge about managing water resources and practicing agriculture in arid conditions continued to be refined and transmitted across generations. The pattern of human adaptation to desert conditions persisted even as the specific populations occupying the region changed through migration, admixture, and population replacement. The mummies document one chapter in this long history of human occupation of one of Earth's most challenging environments, one population's successful adaptation to conditions that tested their knowledge and their resilience, one group's achievement in creating a culture sophisticated enough to leave elaborate burials and distinctive material traditions in a landscape that offered few second chances and that demanded constant attention to the environmental dynamics that made survival possible. The broader implications of the Tarim Mummies' story extend far beyond the specifics of one population in one desert basin during the Bronze Age, reach into fundamental questions about human nature and human history, challenge assumptions that have guided archaeological and anthropological thinking for generations, force reconsideration of what we think we know about how cultures develop, how technologies spread, how populations maintain or lose their identities across time. The traditional model of cultural diffusion, the framework that dominated 20th century archaeology and that still influences how many researchers interpret evidence, assumed that cultural similarities between distant populations resulted primarily from migration and population movement, that when archaeologists found similar pottery styles or burial practices or agricultural techniques in different regions. This similarity indicated that people had moved from one place to another, carrying their culture with them, that genes and culture traveled together as an integrated package. This model made intuitive sense, seemed to explain numerous archaeological patterns, matched historical examples where population movements were well documented, and where cultural change clearly resulted from newcomers arriving and either replacing or mixing with earlier inhabitants. The spread of Indo-European languages across Eurasia, for instance, could be understood through the Yamnaya expansion from the Pontic steppes, through the movement of populations carrying both their distinctive genetic ancestry and their linguistic and cultural traditions into new territories where they established themselves as dominant groups. The spread of agriculture from the Fertile Crescent into Europe could be explained through the migration of farming populations who brought both their crops and their farming knowledge and their genetic ancestry into regions previously occupied by hunter-gatherers. The model worked, explained many patterns, provided a framework for interpreting archaeological evidence that seemed robust and empirically grounded. But the Tarim mummies demonstrated conclusively that this model was incomplete, that cultural diffusion could occur without population movement, that technologies and practices could spread across genetic boundaries through learning and exchange rather than through migration and replacement, that populations could adopt foreign cultural elements while maintaining their genetic distinctiveness, that the relationship between genes and culture was more complex and more variable than simple models of demic diffusion allowed. The early Tarim population had wheat agriculture that originated thousands of miles to the west, had dairy pastoralism that developed among steppe populations with whom they shared no genetic connection, had textile techniques that showed similarities to distant cultures with whom they had no genetic relationship. Yet they maintained remarkable genetic isolation, remained genetically distinct from all their neighbors, preserved ancient North Eurasian ancestry that had disappeared elsewhere through mixing and population replacement. This pattern of genetic isolation combined with cultural cosmopolitanism wasn't just an interesting anomaly, wasn't simply a curious exception that proved the rule, but rather revealed something fundamental about human cultural transmission, about how knowledge spreads through networks that don't require genetic exchange, about how populations can maintain boundaries while still participating in regional systems of trade and communication that transmit innovations across vast distances. The implications rippled across multiple disciplines, forced anthropologists to reconsider assumptions about the correlations between genes and culture, prompted archaeologists to question whether material culture similarities necessarily indicated population movement, required linguists to acknowledge that language shift could occur without genetic replacement, demonstrated that human history was more complex and more interesting than models that assumed tight correlations between different aspects of identity and heritage. The Tarim case also challenged nationalist narratives that claimed ethnic continuity stretching back thousands of years, that used archaeological evidence to assert that particular modern populations were the indigenous inhabitants of particular territories with exclusive historical claims to those lands, that deployed ancient DNA to support contemporary political agendas about who belonged where and who had rights to what. The genetic evidence from the Tarim Basin showed that populations were replaced, that genetic ancestry changed dramatically over time, that no modern group could claim simple continuous descent from Bronze Age inhabitants, that the relationship between ancient and modern populations was complex and mediated through multiple admixture events and population movements that created the genetic diversity visible today. Neither the Uyghur claim to be descended from the earliest Tarim inhabitants, nor the Chinese claim that Xinjiang had always been fundamentally Chinese territory was supported by the genetic evidence, which instead revealed a history of multiple populations successively occupying the region, mixing with each other in complex ways, creating genetic patterns that didn't map neatly onto contemporary ethnic categories or political boundaries. More broadly, the mummies illustrated how marginal environments could serve as refugia, where populations maintained distinctiveness that was lost elsewhere, where genetic variation that disappeared from most of its range could persist in isolated pockets, where cultural and biological diversity could be preserved through isolation even as surrounding regions underwent homogenization through mixing and migration. The ancient North Eurasian genetic component that the Tarim mummies preserved had been diluted or eliminated across most of Eurasia through admixture with incoming populations during the Holocene, survived only as fractional ancestry in most modern groups, disappeared as a distinct population across the vast territories it had once occupied during the Pleistocene. But in the remote oases of the Tarim Basin, in an environment hostile enough to discourage casual migration, in settlements that required specialized knowledge to establish and maintain, this ancient genetic heritage persisted into the Bronze Age, survived thousands of years longer than it did elsewhere, provided modern researchers with a window into genetic variation that would otherwise be completely lost from the contemporary record. This pattern of marginal environments serving as refugia appears repeatedly in human genetic history, appears in multiple regions and multiple time periods, represents an important mechanism for preserving diversity that might otherwise be eliminated through the homogenizing effects of population mixing. Mountain valleys, islands, deserts, Arctic regions, any environment that created barriers to movement or that required specialized adaptations could potentially serve as refugia where populations maintained genetic distinctiveness, where cultural traditions persisted long after they had been replaced elsewhere, where languages survived in isolated form while their relatives disappeared or evolved into unrecognizable daughter languages. The Basque people in the Pyrenees, speaking a non-Indo-European language and showing genetic ancestry distinct from surrounding populations, represent another example of this pattern. Various island populations maintaining distinctive genetic profiles despite being surrounded by different populations represent yet another manifestation of the same principle. The Tarim mummies' preservation itself represents a kind of refuge, represents environmental conditions, protecting organic materials that would decompose completely in most archaeological contexts, represents an accident of burial practice and desert climate that preserved information that would otherwise be permanently lost. The faces we can see, the hair we can examine, the clothing we can analyze, all exist only because the specific combination of burial location and environmental conditions prevented the decomposition that destroyed similar evidence from most other Bronze Age populations. If the Tarim people had lived in wetter climates, if they had practiced different burial traditions, if their cemeteries had been located where groundwater or rainfall could reach them, the mummies wouldn't exist. The bodies would have decayed like billions of others across human history, and the remarkable preservation that allows us to study them in such detail would never have occurred. We would still have bones, would still have archaeological sites and material culture, but we wouldn't have the soft tissue, wouldn't have the DNA preservation that allowed genetic analysis, wouldn't have the clothing and burial goods in the condition that permits detailed examination. The preservation is thus both blessing and curse. Both provides unprecedented information and creates temptation to overinterpret that information. Both offers unique insights into this particular population and risks distorting our understanding of the broader Bronze Age world by focusing attention disproportionately on a population that we can study in extraordinary detail compared to their contemporaries who didn't happen to be buried in conditions that prevented decomposition. How representative were the Tarim people of Bronze Age populations more generally? How typical was their genetic isolation, or was it exceptional, an extreme case that tells us more about the range of human variation than about the central tendencies? How much weight should we give to evidence from one population when that evidence only exists because of preservation accidents that didn't occur elsewhere? These methodological questions don't have simple answers, require careful consideration of sampling biases and preservation biases, and the ways that our knowledge is shaped by what survives rather than by what was actually typical or important in the ancient world. The technological advances that finally allowed genetic analysis of the Tarim mummies, that permitted extraction and sequencing of ancient DNA from 4,000-year-old tissue, that enabled the proteomic analysis of dental calculus that revealed dietary practices, all represent relatively recent developments in archaeological science, represent capabilities that didn't exist when the mummies were first discovered in the 1990s, represent ongoing revolutions in what researchers can learn from archaeological materials. The first attempts at ancient DNA analysis of the Tarim mummies, conducted during the early 2000s using the technologies available at that time, produced ambiguous results that couldn't definitively answer questions about ancestry, couldn't detect admixture at the levels of precision necessary to understand population history, couldn't overcome the degradation and contamination challenges that made ancient DNA work notoriously difficult and controversial during that period. Only with the development of next-generation sequencing, only with improved methods for extracting and concentrating degraded DNA, only with computational approaches that could distinguish authentic ancient sequences from modern contamination, did the comprehensive genetic analysis that revealed the mummies' ancient North Eurasian ancestry become possible. This technological trajectory means that the Tarim mummies' story is still being written, that new analytical methods will continue to reveal information that current technologies cannot detect, that future researchers will be able to ask and answer questions that remain inaccessible today. What else can be learned from the preserved tissues? What information about ancient diseases, about environmental exposures, about physiological adaptations, about dietary stress, about childhood development, about social structures, remains encoded in the mummies waiting for technologies sophisticated enough to extract it? The proteomics analysis of dental calculus that revealed dairy consumption represents just one example of emerging techniques, represents one new window into ancient lives that researchers are only beginning to exploit systematically. What other proteins can be detected? What other biological molecules survive? What isotopic signatures in different tissues can reveal about seasonal movement patterns, about changes in diet across the life course, about environmental conditions during different periods of occupation? The mummies themselves are finite resources, cannot be sampled infinitely, must be preserved for future researchers who will have capabilities we cannot yet imagine, require careful stewardship that balances current research needs against long-term preservation goals. Every sample taken for analysis destroys a portion of the finite material available, creates an ethical obligation to maximize the information extracted, requires justifying that the knowledge gained justifies the destruction of irreplaceable material. This tension between research and preservation, between learning from the past and protecting it for the future, between contemporary questions and future capabilities, characterizes all archaeological work, but becomes particularly acute with unique preserved materials like the Tarim mummies that cannot be replaced or recreated if they're destroyed through oversampling or inadequate curation. The scholarly debates that erupted following the genetic revelations about the Tarim mummies extended beyond questions of population origins and cultural transmission, reached into fundamental theoretical questions about how we conceptualize identity in ancient populations, about what it means to be indigenous, about how we should interpret material culture when genetic evidence complicates straightforward narratives, about the very categories and frameworks that archaeologists and anthropologists use to make sense of the past. The discovery that the early Tarim population maintained genetic isolation while adopting cultural practices from neighbors challenged not just specific historical reconstructions, but the entire conceptual apparatus that researchers had developed for understanding cultural change, for linking archaeological patterns to population processes, for inferring behavior and belief from material remains. One particularly contentious debate centered on whether the Tarim population should be considered indigenous to Central Asia or migrants who had arrived from elsewhere at some point before the Bronze Age period when they first appear in the archaeological record. The genetic evidence showed they descended from ancient North Eurasians, a population that had inhabited northern Eurasia during the Pleistocene, but didn't reveal where specifically the Tarim population had lived during the thousands of years between the Ice Age and their appearance in the desert oases around 2000 BCE. Were they indigenous to the Tarim Basin itself, descendants of populations who had lived in that specific region since the end of the Pleistocene, gradually adapting to the environmental changes that transformed what might have been grassland or parkland into desert? Or were they migrants who arrived from elsewhere in Central Asia, perhaps from mountain regions or northern territories where A&E populations had survived longer than in lowland areas, only establishing themselves in the Tarim Basin when they acquired the agricultural and pastoral technologies necessary to survive in oasis environments? The question matters politically because indigenous status carries implications for contemporary territorial claims, because Uyghur activists had pointed to the mummies as evidence of their own indigeneity, because Chinese officials had used the genetic evidence to argue that no modern population could claim exclusive or primary historical connection to the region. But the question also matters theoretically because it exposes the arbitrariness of timescales in discussions of indigeneity, forces consideration of what temporal depth is required before a population counts as indigenous rather than migrant, acknowledges that all human populations originated somewhere else. If you go back far enough in time, recognizes that the concept of indigenous peoples is politically useful and morally important in contemporary contexts, but becomes progressively more difficult to apply as one moves deeper into prehistory, where everyone was migrating from somewhere and where the very concept of territory and ownership operated differently than it does in modern nation-states. The genetic isolation that characterized the early Tarim population, the fact that they maintained distinct ancestry across many generations while living in an environment that wasn't truly isolated or inaccessible, prompted extensive discussion about the mechanisms that could produce such patterns, about whether genetic boundaries reflected conscious social choices or simply emerged through demographic processes, about what we can and cannot infer about ancient social structures from patterns visible in genetic data. Some researchers argued that the isolation must reflect endogamy, must indicate that the Tarim population deliberately married only within their group, maintained social or religious prohibitions against marrying outsiders, preserved their genetic distinctiveness through cultural practices that enforced boundaries even when geographic barriers didn't prevent contact. This interpretation suggested sophisticated social organization, suggested cultural identity that people valued enough to maintain through marriage rules, suggested that being part of the Tarim community meant something significant to the people themselves, and wasn't just a category that modern researchers imposed retrospectively on ancient populations. Other researchers questioned whether conscious endogamy was necessary to explain the patterns, pointed out that small population sizes combined with geographic dispersion could produce genetic isolation even if no deliberate social barriers existed, noted that we should be cautious about inferring complex social rules from genetic evidence when simpler demographic explanations might suffice, emphasized that the absence of admixture doesn't prove the presence of prohibitions against admixture, but might simply reflect limited opportunities for contact or low rates of migration that wouldn't leave detectable genetic traces. This more conservative interpretation acknowledged that we know remarkably little about Bronze Age social organization in Central Asia, admitted that marriage practices and kinship rules rarely leave direct archaeological evidence, cautioned against building elaborate theoretical structures on foundations that might not support their weight. The debate reflected broader tensions in how genetic evidence should be integrated with archaeological and anthropological interpretation, about whether DNA studies could reveal aspects of social organization and cultural practice, or whether they provided only demographic history that needed to be combined with other evidence before conclusions about society and culture could be drawn. Some geneticists, excited by the power of their methods and eager to extract maximum information from hard-won ancient DNA sequences, pushed interpretations that went beyond what the genetic data alone could strictly support, made claims about social practices and cultural identities that required additional assumptions about how genetic patterns reflected social realities. Some archaeologists, defensive about their traditional domains of expertise and skeptical of the new genetic approaches that seemed to promise definitive answers to questions that archaeology had struggled with for generations, pushed back against overinterpretation, insisted that DNA couldn't tell you everything, emphasized the continued importance of material culture and contextual analysis. The most productive approach, increasingly recognized by researchers on both sides of these disciplinary boundaries, involved genuine interdisciplinary collaboration where geneticists and archaeologists worked together from project conception through interpretation, where each brought their expertise to bear on shared questions, where genetic results informed but didn't determine archaeological interpretation, and where archaeological context shaped how genetic patterns were understood. The Tarim Mummies work that produced the 2021 breakthrough study represented this kind of collaboration, brought together geneticists from multiple institutions with archaeologists who had excavated the sites and anthropologists who understood Central Asian cultural contexts, produced interpretations that acknowledged both what the genetics revealed and what remained uncertain, avoided overreaching while still drawing meaningful conclusions about population history and cultural processes. The public reception of the Tarim Mummies' discoveries, the ways that news media and popular science outlets presented the findings to non-specialist audiences, revealed persistent challenges in communicating complex scientific results about human origins and population history, demonstrated how easily nuanced academic conclusions could be distorted into sensationalist headlines, showed the continued appeal of simple narratives even when evidence pointed toward complexity. Media reports frequently emphasized the European appearance of the mummies, focused on their red and blonde hair and light-colored eyes, described them as mysterious Caucasians in China or lost Europeans who somehow ended up in Asian deserts, framed the story in ways that emphasized racial categories and East-West dichotomies rather than the more complex and more interesting reality that the genetic evidence actually revealed. The genetic data showed that the Tarim mummies weren't European, weren't Western in any meaningful sense, didn't come from populations that contributed substantially to modern European ancestry, but rather represented an ancient Siberian lineage that had persisted in isolation, that happened to have some physical features that modern observers associated with European populations, but that predated the genetic admixtures and population movements that created modern European populations as we know them today. The ANE ancestry that the Tarim mummies carried contributed to many modern populations, including Europeans, Native Americans, and various Central and North Asian groups. But the Tarim people weren't ancestral to any specific modern population in straightforward ways, represented a branch of human genetic diversity that largely disappeared rather than giving rise to descendant populations that survived to the present. But explaining this complexity, communicating that the Tarim mummies represented something more interesting than displaced Europeans, conveying that their significance lay in demonstrating genetic isolation and cultural cosmopolitanism rather than in being Western people in Eastern territories, required more nuance than headlines typically allowed, demanded more attention than casual readers typically invested, fought against preconceptions about race and geography that shaped how people interpreted information about ancient populations. The result was that public understanding of the Tarim mummies often remained superficial or distorted, that the genuinely fascinating questions about how populations maintained boundaries while exchanging culture got lost in simpler narratives about mysterious origins and racial incongruity. The Tarim mummies also became symbols in broader public debates about human diversity and human unity, about whether genetic differences between populations matter and how much they matter, about whether emphasizing common humanity or acknowledging diversity serves better purposes in contemporary society. Some commentators pointed to the mummies as evidence of how diverse human populations have always been, how people with different appearances and different ancestries have moved across the world and mixed and created the genetic complexity visible today, how modern categories of race and ethnicity are recent constructions that don't map onto ancient populations in straightforward ways. From this perspective, the Tarim mummies demonstrated that human diversity is old, is natural, is something to celebrate rather than to fear, shows that movement and mixing and cultural exchange have characterized human societies for thousands of years. Other commentators used the same evidence differently, emphasized the genetic isolation that the Tarim population maintained, pointed to this as evidence that populations can and do maintain distinctiveness across many generations, argued that genetic boundaries weren't just imposed by geography, but reflected social choices and cultural identities that people valued and preserved. From this perspective, the Tarim mummies demonstrated that maintaining group identity is natural, that populations throughout history have recognized differences between themselves and others, that genetic distinctiveness isn't just a modern invention or a racist construct, but reflects real patterns that existed long before modern politics, and that might reflect something fundamental about human social organization. Both interpretations could point to the same genetic evidence, could cite the same research papers, but reached different conclusions about what that evidence meant for contemporary questions about diversity, identity, and belonging. These debates illustrated how scientific evidence about the past inevitably becomes entangled in contemporary political and social concerns, how objective data gets interpreted through subjective lenses shaped by current controversies, how the past serves as a resource that different groups mine for support for different positions. The Tarim mummies themselves, lying in their museum cases or stored in climate-controlled facilities, remained mute witnesses to these debates, their bodies providing evidence that could be analyzed and measured, but that couldn't arbitrate between competing interpretations of what that evidence meant. The genetic sequences extracted from their tissues, the measurements of their skulls and bones, the analysis of their clothing and burial goods, all of this constituted data that researchers could agree upon. But the meaning of that data, the significance of the patterns visible within it, the implications for understanding both the ancient past and the contemporary world, remained contested terrain where science alone couldn't provide definitive answers. The story of the Tarim mummies, when considered in its entirety, represents something far more profound than just another archaeological discovery, something more significant than the addition of new data points to our understanding of Bronze Age Central Asia, something more meaningful than the resolution of debates about population origins or cultural transmission. It represents a mirror held up to ourselves, a reflection of how modern societies engage with the past, a case study in how science and politics and identity become entangled in ways that illuminate both what we know about ancient peoples and what we value in contemporary contexts. The mummies themselves, silent and still in their museum cases and storage facilities, have become vessels into which we pour our questions, our anxieties, our hopes, our competing visions of what human history means and what lessons it might offer for navigating an increasingly complex and interconnected world. What the genetic and archaeological evidence definitively demonstrates is that human populations 4,000 years ago were simultaneously more isolated and more interconnected than simplistic models would suggest, that the Bronze Age world contained both populations maintaining strict genetic boundaries and populations mixing freely across vast distances, that cultural practices and technologies spread through networks that operated independently of genetic exchange, that the relationships between ancestry, culture, language, and identity were complex and variable rather than following universal patterns. The early Tarim population maintained genetic isolation that seems almost impossible given their geographic position and their obvious engagement with neighboring cultures, yet they did maintain it. They did preserve ancient North Eurasian ancestry that disappeared elsewhere. They did create a demographic pattern that challenged every theoretical framework that researchers tried to apply to explain them. The fact that they adopted wheat and barley from the Fertile Crescent, dairy pastoralism from steppe cultures, textile techniques that showed Western connections, irrigation agriculture suited to oasis environments, all while maintaining genetic distinctiveness from the populations who developed or transmitted these innovations, proves that cultural diffusion and genetic admixture can vary independently, that populations can learn from neighbors without intermarrying with them, that technological and cultural exchange doesn't require population movement or genetic mixing. This pattern wasn't unique to the Tarim Basin, appears in other contexts when researchers look carefully, represents an important mechanism of cultural change that traditional models of demic diffusion failed to adequately acknowledge. But the Tarim case made the pattern undeniable, made it impossible to ignore, provided such clear evidence that even skeptics had to acknowledge that genes and culture could move through different networks following different rules. The subsequent demographic changes that brought Sintashta and Andronovo ancestry to the region during the Late Bronze Age, that transformed the genetic landscape while presumably introducing Indo-European languages that would eventually become Tocharian, demonstrated that genetic isolation couldn't be maintained forever, that the boundaries that had preserved ancient North Eurasian ancestry for thousands of years eventually broke down, that incoming populations could and did replace or absorb earlier inhabitants when conditions changed. The genetic data from later periods showing progressive admixture, showing increasingly complex ancestry deriving from multiple sources, showing the kind of mixing that characterized most of Central Asia during the Late Bronze Age and Iron Age, represented the end of the isolation that had made the early Tarim population so distinctive, represented their absorption into the broader Eurasian population mosaic that would eventually give rise to the region's modern inhabitants. Yet the genetic legacy of the early Tarim population didn't disappear completely, survives as traces in modern highland populations of Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, persists in the mitochondrial DNA haplogroups that can be tracked through time, continues in ways that researchers are only beginning to document and understand. The genetic echo that studies have detected in modern Central Asians demonstrates that population replacement, even when substantial, rarely involves complete elimination, that earlier inhabitants leave genetic traces that can persist for thousands of years if demographic conditions allow, that the past doesn't disappear cleanly, but rather gets layered into the present through complex processes of mixing and migration that create the human genetic diversity visible today. The preservation of the mummies themselves, the accident of burial practices, and environmental conditions that kept their bodies intact across 4 millennia represents a gift to future generations, represents evidence about the past that simply doesn't exist for most ancient populations, represents opportunities to learn that become increasingly valuable as analytical technologies improve and new questions become answerable. Every preserved textile, every DNA sequence, every proteomic profile, every isotopic signature, every measurement and observation adds to our understanding not just of the Tarim population specifically, but of Bronze Age societies more generally, of how humans adapted to marginal environments, of how populations maintained or lost their identities across generations, of the full range of human cultural and biological diversity that existed in the ancient world. The political controversies that have surrounded the mummies, the uses and misuses of their discovery to support contemporary claims about indigeneity and territorial rights, the ways that scientific findings have been selectively emphasized or downplayed to serve different agendas, all of this represents both the curse and the blessing of archaeological research that touches on sensitive modern issues. The curse is that political considerations can obstruct research, can prevent questions from being asked or answered, can transform objective investigation into contested territory where every finding gets scrutinized for its political implications. The blessing is that archaeology matters, that people care about what happened in the past, that historical evidence can contribute to contemporary debates even if it rarely provides the simple answers that different sides hope it will support. The Tarim mummies deserved better than to become political symbols, deserved to be studied for what they could reveal about human history rather than for what they might prove about modern territorial claims or ethnic identities, deserved to have their story told completely and honestly rather than being selectively interpreted to support predetermined conclusions. But perhaps that's an unrealistic expectation. Perhaps all archaeology that deals with human remains and cultural heritage inevitably becomes entangled in contemporary politics. Perhaps the very act of studying the past creates stakes in how that past gets interpreted and presented. If so, then the responsibility of researchers becomes not to avoid politically sensitive topics, but to pursue them with extra care, with scrupulous attention to evidence, with honesty about uncertainties and limitations, with determination that political pressures won't determine what questions get asked or what conclusions get drawn from the evidence. The future of Tarim mummies research remains uncertain, depends on political developments in Xinjiang that are impossible to predict, depends on whether international collaboration can continue despite tensions between China and Western nations, depends on whether the mummies themselves can be preserved properly and made accessible to researchers who need samples for analysis using technologies that don't yet exist but will surely be developed in coming decades. The best preserved mummies are finite resources, cannot be sampled infinitely, must be stewarded carefully to balance current research needs against future capabilities. Every sample taken today for analysis is a sample that won't be available for future researchers with better technologies and different questions. Every mummy displayed in a museum or stored in a warehouse is exposed to environmental conditions that gradually degrade organic materials, no matter how careful the curation. The archaeological sites themselves, the cemeteries scattered across the Tarim Basin where hundreds of additional burials remain unexcavated, represent even more fragile resources, represent evidence that could be lost to environmental degradation, to looting, to development pressures that transform remote deserts into economically productive territories. The Xiaohe Cemetery alone contains hundreds of burials that haven't been systematically excavated that could provide more mummies, more artifacts, more evidence about the population that created that remarkable site with its boat coffins and towering poles. Other sites have been identified through survey but never excavated, might contain even better preservation, might answer questions that current evidence leaves unresolved. But excavating them requires permits that Chinese authorities may not grant, requires funding that may not materialize, requires political stability in a region where stability seems increasingly elusive. What remains certain, regardless of what future research does or doesn't occur, is that the Tarim mummies have already transformed our understanding of Bronze Age Eurasia, have already demonstrated that human populations were more diverse in their strategies and more complex in their interactions than previous models acknowledged, have already shown that the past doesn't yield simple answers to simple questions, but rather reveals layers of complexity that challenge our assumptions and force us to think more carefully about how human societies develop and change across time. The faces we can see, the genetic sequences we can analyze, the cultural practices we can document, all represent evidence that will continue to inform discussions about human origins, about population movements, about cultural exchange, about identity and diversity and belonging, for generations to come. The beauty of Lulan, lying in her boat coffin beneath the desert sand for 4,000 years before being discovered and brought to museums where millions have gazed at her preserved features, represents all of this complexity, represents both what we know and what remains mysterious, represents the human individual who lived and died, and whose burial was preserved by environmental accidents we still don't fully understand. She had a name that we'll never know, spoke a language that left no traces, belonged to a culture that disappeared so completely that we can only reconstruct fragments of what it was like. Yet her body provides evidence that allows us to tell at least part of her people's story, to understand something of how they lived, to recognize that they were human beings like ourselves, navigating challenges and creating meaning in a harsh world that tested their knowledge and their resilience every day. That recognition, that fundamental acknowledgement of shared humanity across vast gulfs of time and culture and experience, might be the most important thing the Tarim mummies offer us. More important than the scientific discoveries, more valuable than the political lessons, more enduring than the debates about origins and identities. They remind us that people have always been people, have always cared about their children, have always buried their dead with respect and care, have always created beauty even in difficult circumstances, have always been both unique in their specific cultural expressions and universal in their fundamental humanity. The questions their preserved bodies raise about how populations maintain or lose their identities, about how cultures change while individuals remain recognizably human, about what it means to survive in marginal environments and to leave legacies that persist across millennia, are questions that resonate beyond archaeology, beyond history, into the very heart of what it means to be human in a world that constantly changes while human nature itself remains remarkably consistent across time and space.